Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The unlocking door. From the very first night Michael spent in his new apartment, a nagging sense of unease settled upon him. The unit itself seemed ordinary enough. An old, two-room apartment on the second floor of a building situated at the end of a quiet, unassuming street. The walls were painted a dull, off-white color, the floors were worn hardwood, and a faint, pervasive scent of old varnish and stale air hung in the atmosphere. There was a small, functional kitchen, a cramped living room, and a single bedroom with a narrow window that faced a fire escape. Beyond that window, he could see the brick wall of the adjacent building, a mere 4 feet away. The bathroom was small and featured an old-fashioned toilet with a chain flush. Nothing about the apartment's physical features appeared particularly strange or remarkable. But the front door never stayed locked. That was the unsettling problem. The first night, had he forgotten something? No, he was certain he had locked it. A cold wave of unease washed over him, a tightening in his stomach, a heaviness in his chest. He walked over, peered into the hallway. Nothing, just empty space. He closed the door, locking it carefully, and proceeded with his day, attributing the incident to a lapse in memory, a foolish mistake. The second day, the same thing happened. This time, his annoyance was mixed with a growing anxiety. He decided to test the door even more rigorously. He locked it, slid the chain across, and then, for good measure, pushed a heavy chair in front of it, creating a physical barricade. He even took a picture with his phone, documenting the state of the door. Then he went to bed. He woke up around 7:00 a.m. the next morning and saw that the door was open again. The chair had been pushed aside, the chain was undone, the deadbolt disengaged. He checked the apartment, searching for any sign of intrusion, anything missing. Nothing was gone. The apartment looked exactly as he had left it. He checked his phone's camera roll and found the photo he had taken the previous night. The date and time were clearly displayed, confirming his memory. He hadn't imagined it. He felt his pulse quicken, a throbbing in his neck, a clammy sweat on his palms. He wiped them on his pants, trying to maintain his composure. He spent the next day on the phone with the building's superintendent, a man named Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy, however, seemed unconcerned, even dismissive. He claimed he had no idea what Michael was talking about, stating that the door had functioned perfectly for the previous tenant. He suggested Michael might not be locking it correctly. Michael, increasingly frustrated, insisted that he knew how to lock a door, that he had done so countless times in his life. Mr. Abernathy simply sighed and said he would come by and take a look sometime next week. He never did. Michael decided to take matters into his own hands. The muffled sound of a neighbor's television filtered through the thin walls. Cars passed by outside. He checked the time on his phone repeatedly, hour after agonizing hour. Eventually, sometime after midnight, he drifted off into a fitful sleep. He woke up to the sound of the door creaking. It was a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to jolt him awake. His heart hammered against his ribs. He got out of bed slowly, feeling the cold wooden floor beneath his bare feet. He moved towards the living room, his mouth dry, his throat tight. The small lamp cast a weak, yellowish light. The door was open again, just a crack, revealing the hallway beyond. He saw the new locks hanging loose, exactly as the old ones had. The chain was undone. The padlocks lay on the floor, not broken, but open. His makeshift security camera setup was still in place, undisturbed. He leaned over, grabbed his laptop, and checked the recording. The webcam had captured nothing. The video showed the door, seemingly normal, 1 second, and then the next second it was open. There was no sound of footsteps, no visible movement. To calm his racing pulse, he didn't know what to do. He didn't believe in the supernatural. He had never entertained such notions. He still didn't. but he couldn't explain what was happening. He decided to stay awake until morning, just sitting there in the living room, staring at the door, a baseball bat, an old, forgotten relic he had found in his storage boxes, resting across his lap. He didn't move from the chair. He waited. Nothing else happened that night. The next day, he attempted to discuss the issue with his neighbors. Most of them seemed indifferent, unconcerned. They were older residents, longtime occupants of the building. He asked if they had ever experienced any problems with their doors. They said no. One man simply shrugged and offered a dismissive explanation. It was an old building. The doors and floors were warped, and perhaps the locks weren't aligning properly. But Michael knew he had replaced the locks himself, meticulously. Another neighbor said he had never heard anything coming from Michael's apartment. He looked at Michael with a mixture of suspicion and annoyance, as if he were being bothered unnecessarily. Michael went to the building manager's office, a small, dusty room on the ground floor. The manager, a middle-aged man with a perpetually tired expression, listened to his complaint with an air of weary resignation. He said that if Michael wanted, he could take a look at the door. He followed Michael upstairs and examined the locks. He said they seemed fine. He suggested that perhaps someone had a key. He offered to change the doorknob. Michael accepted, desperate for any solution. They changed the doorknob together, and the manager gave Michael the only set of keys for the new one. Michael watched him discard the old doorknob in a trash bin in the hallway. There was no way anyone else could have a copy. That night, he set up 2 cameras, one facing the door from the inside and another mounted in the hallway, facing the door from the outside. His legs growing sore. He wanted to lie down, but he forced himself to remain awake. He drank some water from the sink. He ate a few crackers from a box in the kitchen. He returned to his chair. He forced his eyes to stay open. The apartment grew colder as the night wore on. He adjusted the heater, but it didn't seem to make much difference. Around 2 a.m., he thought he heard something. It wasn't loud, just a soft click, almost like a lock turning. He looked at the door. Nothing moved. He looked at the laptop. The outside camera showed the hallway empty. The inside camera showed the door still closed. He leaned forward, gripping the bat tighter, his breathing shallow and rapid. He tried not to make any noise. Then the door opened. It opened about an inch, maybe 2. He heard a quiet creak. He saw the chain slide free, the padlocks falling to the floor one after another, making muffled clanking sounds. He saw the deadbolt turn, by itself. He was right there, only a few steps away. He saw it happen in front of his own eyes. His heart pounded so forcefully it felt painful. He tasted something bitter in his mouth. He felt a pressure in his chest that made it difficult to breathe. His hands shook. He tried to stand up, holding the bat, but his knees felt weak, unstable. He looked at the laptop. The outside feed showed nothing. The hallway was empty. The inside feed showed exactly what he was seeing with his own eyes. The door opening on its own, with no one there. He took a step forward, standing in the doorway. He looked left, then right. The hallway was deserted, just the same faded wallpaper and old light fixtures. He looked at the hinges of his door. They seemed perfectly normal. He looked at the floor. It was flat and stable. He tried to pull the door shut, closed normally. He locked it again. He slid the chain. He stepped back, still holding the bat, his heart still hammering. He watched the door for another hour. It stayed closed. Eventually, he fell asleep in the chair, exhausted. He woke up with a stiff neck and the bat still clutched in his hand. The door was still closed, but all the locks were off again. The next day, he meticulously reviewed the footage on his laptop. The landlord said he didn't have time and that if Michael wanted to break his lease, he could, but he wouldn't receive his deposit back. He sounded weary, but he didn't have much money. This apartment was cheap. Besides, he couldn't wrap his head around it. He needed to understand what was happening. He tried another idea. He removed the chain and padlocks entirely and replaced them with a new latch he purchased at the hardware store. He even screwed a sliding bolt into the door frame, adding an extra layer of security. He tested it all thoroughly. That night, he put the cameras back up. He tried to stay awake again, but at some point, he dozed off. He woke up hours later to the sound of the door creaking. He jumped up, ran to it, and found it ajar again. The new latch was on the floor. The sliding bolt was undone. He felt a searing pain in his stomach, a wave of nausea. He didn't vomit, but he felt shaky, weak. He locked it again, but by now, he knew it would never stay locked. The following night, he sat down on the floor directly in front of the door. There was no damage to the locks. They simply opened, somehow. He ended up gathering all his belongings and pushing them into the bedroom. He just wanted to get away from that place. Desert dread, the persistent hitchhiker. This was back before the world went into lockdown, a time when spontaneous road trips were still a viable form of entertainment. I was embarking on a mini-adventure with a couple of friends and their respective girlfriends. I, alas, was the designated fifth wheel, a situation that conveniently provided an excuse to avoid picking up any hitchhikers or stranded motorists. We'd had a previous encounter involving a hitchhiker, a story for another time, perhaps, and we weren't eager to repeat the experience or explain it to anyone new. The full car, we hoped, would serve as a sufficient deterrent. Of course, we'd call for help if someone explicitly requested it, but otherwise we were sticking to our own company. Our group consisted of myself, let's call me Max, a stereotypical dude bro in my early 20s, Theodore and his girlfriend, Jessica, and Robert and his relatively new girlfriend, Amelia. Amelia also had her dog, Doris. "I can ride in the trunk," he declared, his voice raspy and unsettling. "It's no problem." And then, without waiting for permission, he walked around to the back of the car and grabbed the handle of the trunk. Doris, who had been sleeping peacefully until that moment, woke up. The tinted window of the trunk had prevented the hitchhiker from seeing her, and as he tugged at the locked handle, Doris unleashed a barrage of ear-splitting barks. Lhasa Apsos, despite their small size, possess a surprisingly loud and piercing bark, a sound that can cut through even the thickest of walls. The hitchhiker, visibly startled, recoiled. Amelia, seizing the opportunity, began to drive away. He waved his arms in the air, a gesture of frustration or perhaps something more menacing. We drove off, shaken but relieved. Everyone seemed to relax, the tension easing slightly. But just 5 minutes later, we spotted a 24/7 gas station and decided to pull over for fuel and snacks. Amelia traded places with Theodore, who took over driving duties. She took Doris out of the trunk, intending to walk her around for a quick potty break. I believe Jessica went inside the gas station with Theodore, while Robert and I remained outside, chatting. He even gave me a 20% discount. Then, I inquired about their pet policy, mentioning Doris. I waved Amelia over, and she picked up Doris, explaining that the poor dog would be terrified sleeping alone in the car. The motel clerk chuckled, pointing down between his legs. We were all momentarily confused until a dog, remarkably similar to Doris, jumped up into his lap. He laughed, explaining that it would be fine, as long as we paid a $50 pet deposit, refundable upon checkout, provided there was no damage. We settled into the room, making our beds, checking for any hidden cameras, a precaution we always took, and turned on the television, tuning in to a rerun of a popular action comedy show. We lounged on the two beds on one side of the room, snacking and chatting about work and other mundane topics. Jessica suggested I call one of her friends. I grabbed the motel room phone. The double room, despite having all the beds on one side and the sitting area on the other, still had two phones. I sat down on the couch and dialed the reception desk. No one answered. It was, after all, around 4 a.m. I wasn't entirely surprised. I then Googled the motel, searching for the owner's name and contact information. I found his number and called. He answered, sounding confused and slightly annoyed, until I identified myself as a guest. I explained the situation, from the initial encounter with the hitchhiker to the current unsettling presence outside our door. He told me that a homeless individual had attempted to secure a free room earlier that night. He had refused, ordering the man to leave, but the man had lingered, his eyes darting around the parking lot, seemingly assessing the vehicles before finally departing. The owner had then double-checked that all the rooms were locked and retired to his back office. He informed me that he would retrieve his large dog and, if necessary, confront the hitchhiker with a weapon. He asked me to keep an eye out. I went to the window where the door to the farther room had been before the wall was removed and opened the curtain slightly. There he was, standing outside the door he thought led to our room, unaware of the double-room configuration. He was waiting, lurking, like a predator patiently stalking its prey. "Leave before I put you down." The owner was walking from the reception area, his voice filled with righteous anger. A smaller dog walked freely beside him, and he was leading a massive dog, possibly an American Akita, weighing an estimated 160 pounds. The dog looked ferocious, and if the overweight owner hadn't been restraining it, I believe it would have charged the hitchhiker and inflicted serious harm. The hitchhiker, terrified, fled. The owner returned to the reception area, dropping off the large dog before approaching our room. Robert and Amelia, along with Doris, greeted the other small dog briefly. We discussed the events of the night, recounting our initial encounter with the hitchhiker, our refusal to give him a ride. The owner let out a relieved sigh. "Well, at least no one's hurt." Then his smile faded. He squinted, looking down at the door. "What the heck?" he exclaimed, pointing. The scratching at the door hadn't been from a dog's paws. It had been inflicted with a knife or some other sharp implement. The lower hinge of the door was deeply gouged, with chips scattered on the ground. The realization of what could have happened if I had opened that door, mistaking the intruder for a dog, sent a shiver of ice down my spine. We let Jessica and Theodore sleep while we went to the reception area, sharing cold sodas and beers with the owner, maintaining a vigil in case the hitchhiker returned. He regaled us with tales of bizarre motel guests, deaths, and strange occurrences that had unfolded within the motel's walls. The remainder of the early morning was surprisingly pleasant. We woke Theodore and Jessica around 9 a.m. They were astonished that they had slept through the entire ordeal. Jessica was visibly creeped out, while Theodore, ever the stoic, dismissed it as not as bad as last time. We departed around 10 a.m. I added the owner on Facebook, expressing our gratitude and receiving a warm invitation to return anytime. We all left glowing 5-star reviews. As we drove around the corner, continuing our journey, I glanced into the roadside tumbleweeds. There, discarded on the ground, lay the red pants, the brown jacket, and a pair of shoes. I didn't see or hear the hitchhiker, but an unshakable feeling that he was watching, somewhere out there, persisted. We drove for over 5 hours before stopping again, and by then, the lingering anxiety had begun to dissipate. The rest of the trip was uneventful. On our return journey, we noticed that only one shoe and fragments of the jacket remained. We stayed at the same motel again, and nothing untoward occurred. But the motel owner informed us that it wasn't uncommon for people to venture into the desert and never return. Whether the hitchhiker had perished, stolen new clothes, or simply hitchhiked away naked, I will likely never know. But to this day, I am eternally grateful that I didn't open that door, that I trusted my instincts, and that Doris, the tiny, fierce Lhasa Apso, stood guard, preventing a potentially catastrophic encounter. The desert, it seems, holds many secrets, and some are best left undisturbed. The digital demon, a descent into online dread. These days, I tread carefully in the treacherous waters of social media. There was a time back in my early college days when I was a fervent devotee of Facebook. It was my lifeline to friends and family back home, a comforting illusion of connection in the isolating expanse of university life. I meticulously curated my online persona, building a collection of photographs, checking into various locations, sharing every trivial detail of my existence, all in a desperate bid to showcase how wonderfully I was thriving. My entire world, or at least a carefully constructed version of it, was on display for all to see. and in my youthful naivete, I was remarkably lax with my privacy settings. One day, I received a message request from a complete stranger, someone I had never encountered before. It was a simple, unassuming "hey." I checked their profile, scanning for any mutual connections, perhaps a shared class or a common acquaintance. But there were none. This individual resided on the opposite side of the country. My curiosity, as it often does, got the better of me. I replied, "Hey, do we know each other?" I can't recall precisely what I expected his response to be. Perhaps he was searching for someone with the same name, a case of mistaken identity. But when his reply materialized, it was far from anything I could have anticipated. It read, simply, "I'm going to kill you, cowboy hat face." The cowboy emoji, a seemingly innocuous symbol, added a layer of surreal, unsettling absurdity to the threat. I stared at the message, my mind struggling to process it. Fear hadn't yet taken hold. It was more a sense of bewildered disbelief. What the heck? I revisited the sender's profile, delving deeper into his online persona. I found a series of photographs depicting him wielding knives in a wooded area. That, in itself, was somewhat intimidating. But what truly chilled me were his posts, rambling, incoherent rants about the unfairness of life, his profound dissatisfaction, and his desire to inflict pain on someone deserving. Then there were the videos, unplayable, removed by Facebook administrators, likely for violating community standards. But the captions remained, offering a glimpse into the darkness within. That chainsaw goes through his neck like Butterface with tears of joy. The laughing crying emoji, typically a symbol of amusement, took on a sinister, grotesque quality in this context. That's when the fear truly set in. This wasn't some playful prank, a teenager's attempt at dark humor. This individual seemed genuinely unhinged, consumed by a simmering rage, and he had, potentially, been studying my online life for weeks, absorbing every detail I had carelessly shared. He could have screenshotted my photos, my posts. As I scrolled through them, a growing sense of unease washed over me. I couldn't be certain, but the scenery in those photographs, it looked eerily familiar. It resembled the town where I was living. Potentially, the motivation haunted me in ways I could never have imagined. Social media, I realized, is a double-edged sword. We put ourselves out there, exposing ourselves to the world, and there's no telling who might be lurking, observing, collecting information. Now, I'm different. I'm cautious, almost paranoid. I don't post much. I don't use my real name. My privacy settings are as stringent as possible. And I strongly advise everyone to do the same, because you never know who might be watching. You never know whose dark fantasies might be fueled by the seemingly harmless details of your online life. The digital demon, as I came to think of him, may have been a phantom, a threat that never fully materialized. But the fear he instilled, the vulnerability he exposed, remains a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of the internet. The experience changed me, casting a long, unsettling shadow over my relationship with the online world. It made me question the nature of connection, the illusion of safety, and the price we pay for sharing our lives with strangers. The legacy of the peculiar Prestons. I believe every neighborhood harbors a family that exists on the fringes of normalcy, a clan of eccentrics or, in some cases, outright psychos. Conversations with friends and acquaintances have reinforced this belief. Almost everyone seems to have a story about a peculiar family, a group that defied social conventions and inspired a mixture of fascination and fear. These stories often culminate in some dramatic event, a heated family argument spilling out into the streets, a confrontation with neighbors, a police intervention, perhaps even a for sale sign appearing in the aftermath. But my story, the tale of the Preston family, doesn't follow that familiar trajectory. It's a story that lingers, unsettling in its ambiguity, haunted by possibilities and ramifications that continue to chill me to the bone. I grew up in 1970s Britain in a small, close-knit town nestled in Wiltshire. It was a community where everyone knew everyone else, and, consequently, everyone knew everyone else's business. The Preston family, a name that, in itself, I remember feeling a pang of sympathy for him, but as time went on, his outbursts became commonplace, almost expected. The Prestons were the weird family, and their weirdness, for the most part, seemed to be contained within their own family unit. People simply let them be. The next significant incident I recall occurred years later, during secondary school. The schoolyard suddenly erupted in a flurry of whispers and excited chatter. Students crowded around the school gates, gawking, some laughing, some simply staring in disbelief. The object of their attention was Lucas, dressed in his full school uniform, with one glaring omission: his trousers. He stood there, exposed and humiliated, wearing only his school jumper, shoes, and underwear. Rumors spread like wildfire. The prevailing theory was that Lucas hadn't been ready to leave the house when his father, Mr. Preston, was prepared to drive him to school. Instead of waiting, Mr. Preston had allegedly dragged Lucas to the car, driving him to school in his underwear, a cruel and unusual form of punishment, a twisted lesson in punctuality. I can't vouch for the veracity of the reasoning, but I can confirm with my own eyes that I witnessed Lucas walking into school that day, subjected to the stares and jeers of his peers. It was a blatant act of public humiliation, a testament to the dysfunctional dynamics within the Preston household. It's baffling, in retrospect, how Lucas was allowed to remain in the custody of his evidently abusive parents. Rumors circulated of a visit from social services, but I believe this to be true because for a while, the incidents seemed to subside. The Prestons, it appeared, had been sufficiently shaken by the intervention, or at least had learned to conceal their dysfunction more effectively. This period of relative calm, however, was merely the prelude to a far more catastrophic event. It all came to a head when I was around 15, just over a year before we were due to leave secondary school and bid farewell to compulsory education. One morning, Lucas arrived at school dressed in his own clothes, a pair of sneakers and a brightly colored jumper. A teacher, Mr. Davies, who I suspect was well acquainted with the Preston family's troubled history, pulled Lucas aside. They spoke in hushed tones before disappearing into the building that housed the main office. The next thing I knew, Lucas was sporting an entirely new school uniform, new blazer, new tie, new jumper, everything. And from that day forward, he seemed transformed. He no longer relied on his parents for transportation to school. He exuded a newfound confidence, an openness he had never displayed before. He became more sociable, engaging with other students, even joining us for games of football during lunchtime, something he had previously avoided. We actually became quite friendly with him for a while. On several occasions, he invited us back to his house to play, to hang out. We, of course, politely declined, inventing excuses to avoid venturing into the unsettling realm of the Preston household. But still, when I said that, Beatrice exchanged a look with Elijah, a look that I now understand to be a complex mixture of horror and relief. It was as if I had narrowly avoided some unimaginable danger. Not long after, word began to spread through my circle of friends. There had been a brutal double murder in town. Someone had been arrested. Our quiet, uneventful community was reeling. Speculation ran rampant. Who was the killer? What had motivated such a heinous act? The adults, perhaps in an attempt to shield us from the gruesome details, remained tight-lipped. But it was only a matter of time before the truth, however fragmented, trickled down to us. The reason Lucas's parents were no longer around, the reason he had exhibited such a dramatic shift in demeanor, such uncharacteristic happiness and confidence, was because he had killed them. He had, in his own twisted way, liberated himself from the source of his misery. I can, on some level, understand that. But the fact that a child murdering his own parents could result in such a profound sense of relief, such a palpable lifting of a burden, that is something I have never been able to fully comprehend. The truly horrifying aspect emerged years later, as I pieced together the fragments of information, reconstructing the timeline of events. The day he came to school in his own clothes was likely the morning after he had committed the murders. His school uniform, presumably stained with blood, had to be disposed of, and the invitations. The times he had invited us back to his house to watch television, to play football. His parents would have been dead, their bodies likely decomposing in the upstairs bedroom, assuming that's where the murders had taken place. If we had accepted his invitation, we might have smelled the decay, seen flies buzzing around the bedroom door. We were just one impulsive yes away from stumbling upon a scene of unimaginable horror. And if that had happened, would Lucas have killed us too, to silence us, to protect his gruesome secret? The thought is chilling, a constant reminder of the fragility of life, the proximity of darkness, even in the most seemingly ordinary of settings. The legacy of the peculiar Prestons is not one of quaint eccentricity, but of unspeakable tragedy, a darkness that lingers, casting a long, unsettling shadow over my childhood memories. The rancid brew, a coffee machine nightmare. Of all the regrettable purchases I've made in my life, of all the impulsive buys and ill-conceived acquisitions, there's one that stands out, a transaction that fills me with a unique blend of disgust and mortification. A coffee machine, procured through the digital bazaar known as Facebook Marketplace. It was, on the surface, a steal, a gleaming, Italian-made espresso machine, offered at a price that seemed almost too good to be true. I, a caffeine addict of discerning taste, was instantly captivated. I expected a few minor flaws, perhaps a cosmetic blemish or two, the usual wear and tear associated with pre-owned appliances. But what I received was something else entirely. When the package arrived, delivered by the ever-reliable UPS, I eagerly tore it open, anticipation bubbling within me. The machine, while aesthetically pleasing, was barely functional. It sputtered and groaned, producing a lukewarm, vaguely coffee-flavored liquid that was a far cry from the rich, aromatic brew I craved. Still, it was Italian-made, a symbol of quality craftsmanship, and it would suffice, I reasoned, until my next paycheck arrived, allowing me to invest in a more reliable replacement. I would simply discard this flawed machine once its successor arrived. But over the next couple of days, a new, unsettling element entered the equation. I began to hear a strange, rhythmic ticking sound emanating from within the machine. It was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, unlike anything I had ever heard a coffee maker produce. I could have, of course, contacted a repair technician, but the prospect of spending more money on this already disappointing purchase seemed absurd. I had resigned myself to its eventual demise, its destiny a landfill or perhaps a recycling center. Then, one morning, as I was preparing my daily dose of caffeine, I saw it, or rather I thought I saw it, a fleeting movement, a subtle shift in the shadows atop the machine. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of sleep-deprived eyes. But the thought, the nagging suspicion, lingered, refusing to be ignored. Later that morning, fueled by a growing sense of unease, I decided to investigate. I would dismantle the machine, peer into its inner workings, and confront whatever was lurking within. It took some effort, a frustrating struggle with screws and panels, but I finally managed to remove the outer casing, exposing the machine's intricate innards. And then I screamed. It was a scream that, I swear, could have shattered glass. It was a primal, involuntary response to a sight so utterly revolting, so profoundly disturbing, that it bypassed all rational thought. Inside the coffee machine, nestled among the wires and tubes, was a nest. Not a bird's nest, not a mouse's nest, but a writhing, pulsating mass of cockroaches. The largest, most disgusting infestation I had ever encountered. To this day, the mere thought of those creatures, those vile, skittering insects, fills me with a visceral revulsion. And to think I had been using that machine, that infested breeding ground, to brew my morning coffee. The thought alone is enough to induce nausea, even years later. As soon as I screamed and dropped the lid onto the kitchen counter, the startled roaches scattered, a wave of chitinous bodies fleeing in every direction. It was a scene straight out of a horror film, a nightmare made real. I fled the kitchen, abandoning the scene to my husband, Benjamin. a costly and disruptive undertaking, but it was a small price to pay, a necessary sacrifice to eradicate those vile creatures from our living space. That Italian-made espresso machine, initially perceived as a bargain, turned out to be the most expensive coffee maker I had ever purchased, factoring in the hundreds of dollars spent on extermination services. It's a cautionary tale, a testament to the adage that sometimes you truly get what you pay for, and sometimes what you get is a rancid brew of disappointment, disgust, and a horrifying infestation of cockroaches, all served up in a deceptively appealing package. The memory remains, a potent reminder to never, ever underestimate the potential horrors that can lurk within a seemingly innocuous second-hand purchase. The smell. I can almost still smell the faint, musty odor that clung to the machine, a scent that now, forever, will be associated with that writhing mass of insect life, the canine guardian of the coastal cliffs. To fully appreciate this story, one must first understand a peculiar aspect of our country's legal landscape, the absence of trespassing laws, at least in the traditional sense. So long as the area is left in the same condition as it was found. This freedom, this lack of restriction, was a cornerstone of my childhood. Camping trips were a frequent occurrence. Family excursions undertaken with a large group of my parents, Theodore and Eleanor's friends and their children. On average, there were perhaps 10 of us, a logistical challenge, but a joyous, chaotic adventure. We always gravitated towards a specific, secluded beach on the coast, a hidden gem far removed from the hustle and bustle of civilization. It wasn't entirely isolated, though. Yachts often bobbed gently just offshore, their occupants enjoying the tranquility, and other campers dotted the shoreline, their tents forming a temporary, informal settlement. Most of these fellow campers also had children or teenagers, creating a family-friendly atmosphere far removed from the raucous party scenes one might associate with coastal gatherings. There was even a small, rudimentary building nearby, housing toilets and showers, a surprising amenity in such a remote location. It seemed the local council, perhaps weary of dealing with the less savory aspects of unregulated camping, had decided to provide some basic facilities. Our fateful trip occurred in the spring of 2011. I know this with certainty because I had adopted my beloved dog, Parmesan, in the winter of 2010, having selected her from a local shelter that November, a birthday gift to myself, funded by my own meager savings. Let me tell you about Parmesan. She came to me as a 6-month-old puppy, a survivor of a dog-fighting ring. Her breed was uncertain, a mix of various bloodlines, but my best guess was a Lurcher Staffordshire Terrier cross. She possessed a wonderfully gentle temperament with people and most other dogs, but she was fiercely protective, a trait that would soon prove invaluable. By the time of this particular camping trip, I had owned Parmesan for several months. She had never experienced the joys of camping, but in our family, dogs were considered integral members of the camping crew. So when we piled into the car, Parmesan came along. The drive was a lengthy one, approximately 6 hours. For reasons I can't fully recall, perhaps a late departure, a series of unforeseen delays, we arrived at our destination as the sun was setting. This was far from ideal, as setting up a tent in near darkness is a notoriously frustrating endeavor. We had anticipated arriving to find other campers already established, their tents illuminated by the warm glow of campfires. But the beach was deserted, an unsettling emptiness greeting us. Despite this, my parents began the arduous task of unloading the car and attempting to erect the tent. They instructed my sister, Olivia, and me to retrieve some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car while they focused on the tent, using a flashlight to illuminate the sandy ground. I rolled down the car window for Parmesan, ensuring she had access to fresh air. It was unusually warm for that time of year, and I always prioritized my furry companion's comfort. We were fumbling around in the darkness, the vast expanse of the beach shrouded in an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the gentle lapping of waves. The only road leading to this beach was a circular one, as they occasionally conducted inspections of the area. The man's gait was a flicker of dark humor masking my growing fear. Junkies were not an uncommon sight, but encountering one in such a remote location, in the darkness, was undeniably unsettling. As he entered the beam of our flashlight, we saw it. A large knife, perhaps 15 inches in length, though my perception of size might have been distorted by my youth and the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I may not have held my father in high regard, but I must give him credit for his immediate reaction. He stood up, gripping the camping mallet firmly, positioning himself between us and the approaching threat. The man began to shout. Olivia and I were crying. I remember shaking uncontrollably, consumed by a primal terror. It genuinely felt as though a physical confrontation was imminent, and I didn't fancy Theodore's chances against a knife-wielding, intoxicated assailant. It's grim to contemplate, but I am convinced that this man intended to harm us, perhaps even kill us. I believe he would have attacked Theodore, and then possibly turned his attention to us. I doubt Eleanor, bless her heart, would have had the presence of mind to flee with us. She had a tendency to prioritize Theodore, their relationship above all else. But that's not how events unfolded. From the darkness, a blur of motion, a force of nature, intervened. Parmesan, like a wolf descending upon its prey, she launched herself at the assailant, a bolt of pure canine fury. She attacked with precision and ferocity, targeting the man's arm, clamping down with her powerful jaws. She ripped his jacket, tearing through the fabric, drawing blood. He dropped the knife, the weapon clattering onto the sand. He kicked her, punched her, desperately trying to dislodge her. Eventually, he succeeded. He scrambled to retrieve the knife, then fled back to his car, speeding away into the night. Parmesan didn't pursue him. The next half hour was one of the most agonizing experiences of my life. I had a complete breakdown, as did, I suspect, everyone else in the car. My parents attempted to maintain a semblance of composure to avoid further upsetting us, but we weren't toddlers. We were old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, the very real threat we faced. Theodore turned off the radio, and the man continued to follow us for a staggering 55 miles. Our fuel gauge needle hovered on the ominous E for the final 10 miles, a testament to our dwindling resources. We were running on fumes, a miracle of automotive engineering, or perhaps, as some might suggest, a touch of divine intervention. Finally, he veered off onto another road, disappearing from our rearview mirror. We drove into a gas station in the next town, refueled, and continued our journey home. Olivia and I slept in the car for the remainder of the drive, waking only upon our arrival. After a few hours of much-needed sleep, Eleanor contacted the non-emergency police line, reporting the incident. They never followed up. Apparently, the woman she spoke to mentioned that they might wish to contact us in the future, as the man matched the description of a suspect wanted in connection with a murder charge. Whether he was, in fact, that suspect or simply a random, violent individual, I will likely never know. As I said, the police never contacted us again. The takeaway from this harrowing experience, beyond the obvious crazy man on the beach narrative, is this: I love Parmesan. I love dogs. She is still with us, elderly and grizzled, a living testament to her unwavering loyalty. I don't know why she acted as she did that day. I can't claim to understand her thought processes. But what I do know is that this poor dog, born into a world of abuse and neglect, rescued from a life of violence, found a way to forgive, to trust, to protect. I never trust a person who dislikes dogs, but I always trust a dog when they dislike a person. They possess an uncanny ability to decipher human body language, to sense danger. And I believe Parmesan sensed the profound threat posed by that man, acting instinctively to defend her pack. If you're able, please consider adopting a dog. You might just find yourself in a similar situation someday, though I sincerely hope you don't. But I can promise you this: if you're willing to save a four-legged friend's life, they will repay you tenfold, with unwavering loyalty and, if necessary, selfless courage, without a moment's hesitation. I paid a paltry sum for Parmesan's adoption fee, a small price for a life saved, and a life that, in turn, may very well have saved ours. The canine guardian of the coastal cliffs, she remains a symbol of unwavering love and protection, a furry hero in a world that often feels far too dangerous. The legend of the lung eater, a scout scar, my childhood, spent in the verdant landscapes of North Carolina, a much-needed respite from my boundless energy. Well, all except for this one time. One summer, our troop embarked on a grand camping adventure, a journey into the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains. For those unfamiliar, the Smokies or Great Smoky Mountains are a sub-range of the Appalachian Mountains, home to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Spearfinger's skin was composed of solid stone, rendering her impervious to the arrows of the Cherokee warriors. Her footsteps, when she traversed the mountainsides, resonated like thunder, and when her deep, guttural voice echoed through the hills, it would scatter the birds, a chilling warning to those she hunted. She would sing her favorite song, a macabre lullaby, Uva la Natsudi, which translates to liver, I eat it. Spearfinger, Mr. Henderson continued, possessed the ability to shapeshift, to assume the appearance of her victims' family members, before plunging her pointed finger into their backs, piercing their hearts or necks. Then, she would tear out their livers, feasting on the organs, her stone lips smeared with fresh, dark blood. By the time Mr. Henderson concluded his tale, we were understandably petrified. The campfire, which had previously offered warmth and comfort, now seemed to cast flickering, menacing shadows. We only managed to regain some semblance of composure after he retrieved his old guitar and serenaded us with a few calming folk songs. But that night, back in my tent, shared with a fellow scout named Timothy, sleep eluded me. My imagination, fueled by Mr. Henderson's vivid narrative, conjured images of Spearfinger, her stony form lurking just beyond the thin fabric of our tent, her long, sharp finger poised to strike, her hunger for livers insatiable. Just as I was finally beginning to drift off, a bright light illuminated one side of the tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Fear, raw and primal, gripped me. I whispered to Timothy, urging him to wake up, but he remained stubbornly asleep, lost in the depths of slumber. I stared at the side of the tent, my eyes wide with terror, trying to discern the source of the intense light. It seemed far too bright to be a mere flashlight. Then I heard it, faint, hissing sound, and I saw it, a shadow passing over the fabric of the tent. I called out, my voice a trembling whisper, "Who's there?" Silence, only the hissing sound, repeated, closer this time. Then the figure raised a hand, and I almost choked on my own fear. A single, long, pointed finger, silhouetted against the illuminated tent wall. I screamed, a blood-curdling shriek that ripped through the quiet night. I scrambled out of the tent, tearing through the front flap, running blindly through the campsite, yelling, "It's Spearfinger! The Spearfinger! She's come to eat my liver! Please, don't let her eat my liver!" I expected chaos. I expected the other scouts to erupt from their tents in terror, or to cower within, hoping to be spared Spearfinger's wrath. There were, indeed, a few cries of fear that mingled with my own. But the sound that ultimately brought me to a halt, that made me stop and peer around in bewildered confusion, was the sound of laughter. It was another scout, a boy named Ethan. He was doubled over, is forever intertwined with the image of that twig, the hissing sound, and the lingering fear of a mythical creature with a taste for human livers. And, perhaps most disturbingly, I can no longer look at liver in the deli section of a grocery store without a shudder, without my mind conjuring the image of Spearfinger, hushing a child to sleep, stroking their hair, singing a macabre lullaby in the voice of a beloved relative, all before tearing out their liver and feasting on it, her stony lips stained with the dark, crimson evidence of her gruesome meal. The legend of the lung eater, as Ethan's prank inadvertently transformed it, became a personal, deeply unsettling scar, a chilling reminder of a childhood fear that, even now, refuses to be fully extinguished. The Gothic mansion mystery. Emily stared up at Blackwood Manor, its imposing silhouette a stark contrast to the vibrant hues of the twilight sky. A shiver danced down her spine, a sensation far more profound than the gentle chill of the autumn air. She clutched the heavy iron key, her pulse quickening with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. After all, it wasn't every day one was entrusted with the care of a sprawling estate that seemed to have materialized from the pages of a Gothic novel. With a deep breath, she pushed open the massive oak door, the echoing groan that reverberated through the cavernous entryway amplifying her unease. "Hello?" she called out, her voice a mere whisper in the overwhelming silence. Only the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock answered her. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered to herself. "You're alone, just as Mrs. Davenport said. No need to be spooked by shadows." Hauling her suitcase up the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the plush runner, she found her way to the designated bedroom. It was larger than her entire apartment, boasting a four-poster bed that could comfortably accommodate a small family. Unpacking swiftly, she was eager to explore the mansion before darkness fully enveloped it. Room after room unfolded before her, each more lavish than the last. A sunroom overflowing with exotic flora. It was like stepping into a bygone era of wealth and faded grandeur. As night fell, she retreated to the kitchen. The sleek modern appliances seemed strangely out of place amidst the antique decor, a jarring reminder of the present day. She ate her solitary meal in the oppressive silence, the clinking of her fork against the china uncomfortably loud. Sleep was a fitful visitor that night. The house creaked and groaned around her, settling in ways her city apartment building never did. Every unfamiliar sound sent her heart racing before she remembered where she was. The following day passed without incident. She worked remotely from the library, the Wi-Fi surprisingly strong for such an old house. As evening approached, she decided to indulge in a long bath in the claw-footed tub, hoping to soothe her frazzled nerves. She was just sinking into the steaming water when she heard a thud followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Her blood ran cold. She held her breath, straining to listen. There it was again, the slow, deliberate tread of someone moving stealthily. "It's just the house settling," she tried to convince herself, "or your imagination." But deep down, she knew better. With trembling hands, she got out of the tub and dressed quickly. Pressing her ear against the bathroom door, she listened intently. The footsteps had ceased, but now she could hear something else, the soft click of drawers opening and closing. Someone was in the house, searching for something. Panic clawed at her throat. Her phone was in the bedroom, the landline downstairs. She was trapped. "Think, Emily, think," she whispered, her eyes scanning the bathroom for anything that could serve as a weapon. Her gaze fell on a heavy porcelain vase. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Taking a deep breath, she eased the bathroom door open. The hallway was empty, but she could hear movement coming from one of the guest rooms. As silently as possible, she crept towards the staircase. She had just reached the top step when a floorboard betrayed her with a loud creak. The noise from the guest room stopped abruptly. Heart pounding, she flew down the stairs, taking them two at a time. She could hear heavy footsteps behind her, giving chase. She ran for the front door, only to find it locked. In her panic, she couldn't remember which key was which. A hand clamped down on her shoulder, spinning her around. She lashed out blindly with the vase, feeling it connect with something solid. There was a grunt of pain, and the grip on her shoulder loosened. She didn't wait to see who her attacker was. She ran for the kitchen, the back door her only hope. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the oven clock. She stumbled through it, hands outstretched, searching for the door. Her fingers brushed against cool glass. The door. She fumbled for the handle, her sweaty hands slipping on the smooth metal. Got it! She wrenched the door open and burst out into the cool night air. The expansive lawn stretched before her, the trees at its edge a dark, forbidding wall. She ran towards them, the damp grass soaking through her socks. She had just reached the tree line when she heard the back door slam open. "Stop!" a deep voice bellowed. The sound spurred her on, pushing her deeper into the woods. Branches whipped at her face, roots threatening to trip her with every step. She had no idea where she was going, no plan beyond escape. She didn't know how long she ran. Could have been minutes or hours. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but fear propelled her forward. Finally, when she felt she couldn't take another step, she saw lights through the trees. A house. She stumbled towards it, relief washing over her. As she broke through the tree line, she realized with a start that she recognized the house. It was Blackwood Manor. Somehow, in her blind panic, she had run in a circle. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure what to do. Then she saw a car in the driveway that hadn't been there before, a police car. Safety. She ran towards it, waving her arms. "Help!" she screamed. "Oh, please help me." The front door of the mansion opened, and a police officer stepped out, followed by Mrs. Davenport. "Oh, thank God," Mrs. Davenport said, rushing towards her. "Emily, dear, are you all right? We've been so worried." Emily stared at her, bewildered. "There's someone in the house," she managed to gasp out. "An intruder. He chased me." Mrs. Davenport and the officer exchanged a look. "Emily," Mrs. Davenport said gently, "there's no intruder. It's just George." As if summoned by his name, a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and a kind face. There was a bruise forming on his cheek. "I'm so sorry for frightening you," he said, his voice deep and apologetic, the same voice that had shouted after her in the woods. "I should have announced myself. Emily, this is my husband, George," Mrs. Davenport explained. "He wasn't supposed to be back until next week, but his business trip ended early. He came home to surprise me, not realizing I had asked you to house sit." The adrenaline that had been keeping Emily going suddenly evaporated, leaving her weak and trembling. But the noises, the searching, George looked sheepish. "I was looking for my reading glasses. I didn't want to wake you, so I was trying to be quiet. When I heard you run, I tried to explain." He gestured to his bruised cheek. "You have quite an arm." Emily felt her face burn with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. I didn't." No, it's my fault entirely," George insisted. "I should have called ahead or at least turned on some lights." Mrs. Davenport put an arm around Emily's shoulders. "Come inside, dear. You're shaking like a leaf. Let's get you warmed up, and we'll sort this all out." As they walked back to the house, the police officer following behind, Emily couldn't help but laugh. All that terror, all that running, and it had been a simple misunderstanding. But later that night, as she lay in bed listening to the Davenports move about the house, a small part of her wondered, what if it hadn't been George? What if it had been a real intruder? She pulled the covers up higher, suddenly aware of just how big and empty the mansion was, and how many places there were for someone or something to hide. Sleep was a long time coming that night. The chilling phone call. This incident occurred during my freshman year of high school. I'm 20 now, and it's been years since I last pondered it. It was during my third period class literacy workshop, to be exact. The class was small, around 10 to 12 students, and we were engaged in a group activity. It was quite loud, and we were all having fun when the classroom phone rang. My teacher, Ms. Johnson, answered it and immediately fixed her gaze on me. After a brief pause, she said someone was on the phone for me. This caught me off guard, but I assumed it was one of my parents. However, they usually just texted me. I stood up, and Ms. Johnson handed me the phone before returning to the class activity. I put the phone to my ear, about to say hello when the person on the other line abruptly interrupted me. "I'm going to kill you," the voice hissed. "Chop you up, put you in a bag, and throw your pieces in the back of my truck." He then proceeded to reveal personal information about me. My address, phone number, the street I lived on. He even knew which class I was in and my teacher's name. I didn't have a chance to speak before he hung up. I had no clue who this person was. Johnson and my classmates started to wonder what the caller had said, as I hadn't spoken a word. I'm sure my facial expression was quite strange. Ms. Johnson inquired if everything was all right, and I simply responded, "Yeah, everything's fine." When class ended, I considered telling Ms. Johnson what the caller had said but decided against it. For some reason, I didn't think she would take it seriously. This left me with several questions. Who was this person? How did he know so much about me? Why was he saying these things to me? What had I done to him? I'd never wronged anyone to the extent that they would feel this way. After basketball practice, as my friend's mom drove me home, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. It was winter, so it was dark by the time we were driving. At one point, I did notice a black pickup truck that sped off just as we pulled into my driveway, but I couldn't see the driver. I never told anyone about the phone call, and I never heard that man's voice or saw that black pickup truck ever again. Lost in the Cascades. The first rays of sunlight filtering through the dense canopy revealed a harsh truth to Ethan. He was hopelessly lost. What began as a rejuvenating solo trek through the Cascade Mountains had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, and he was about to stumble into something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. Ethan had always prided himself on his wilderness skills. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, he'd spent countless hours exploring the forests, more at home among the trees than in his own backyard. But as he stood there, his worn hiking boots sinking into the damp earth, a shiver coursed through him that had nothing to do with the crisp mountain air. The trail he'd been following for the past 2 days had gradually faded, until it vanished altogether. He'd pressed on, confident in his ability to navigate by the sun and his trusty compass. Now, surrounded by towering pines and jagged rock formations, every direction looked the same. Taking a deep breath to quell the rising panic, he muttered to himself, "Stay calm, Ethan. Panic is the enemy." He decided to climb to higher ground, hoping to spot a familiar landmark or perhaps catch a glimpse of the distant highway. The ascent was steep, his muscles protesting with every step. He was rationing his water, unsure when he'd find a stream to refill his bottles. As he neared the top of the ridge, a sound reached him that made him freeze mid-step. Voices. Human voices. Relief washed over him. Other hikers. Perhaps, maybe they could point him in the right direction. He quickened his pace, ignoring the burning in his thighs. But as he drew closer, the voices grew clearer, and his relief curdled into unease. These weren't the cheerful tones of fellow nature enthusiasts. The voices were low, harsh, punctuated by the occasional clang of metal against metal. Slowing down, he moved as silently as possible. Years of hunting with his father had taught him how to navigate the forest without making a sound. He crouched behind a large boulder, peering cautiously around it. What he saw made his blood run cold. In a small clearing about 50 yards away, 3 men were gathered around what looked like a makeshift laboratory. Plastic containers, tubing, propane tanks, the telltale signs of a clandestine operation. One man carefully measured out a white powder, while another stirred a bubbling cauldron over a portable stove. Ethan didn't need a chemistry degree to recognize the scene. A meth lab, hidden deep in the wilderness where no one was likely to stumble upon it. Except he had. He held his breath, not daring to move a muscle. These men were dangerous, that much was clear. If they caught him, he doubted they'd simply let him go on his way. "Damn it, Frank!" one of the men suddenly shouted, making Ethan flinch. "I told you to watch the temperature. You're going to ruin the whole batch." "Screw you, Mark," the man stirring the pot shot back. "I know what I'm doing. Both of you shut up." The third man growled, clearly the leader. "We don't need any noise carrying. Last thing we need is some nosy hiker stumbling on us." If only they knew. Ethan knew he needed to get out of there, and fast. But which way? He was lost to begin with, and now he had to factor in avoiding these criminals. One wrong move, one snapped twig, and he could be discovered. Slowly, carefully, he began to back away from his hiding spot. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure they must be able to hear it. Crack. The sound of a branch breaking under his foot was like a gunshot in the quiet forest. He froze, his whole body tensing. "What was that?" one of the men said sharply. "Probably just a deer." Another replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "Check it out," the leader commanded. Could be a bear, attracted by the smell. Ethan heard footsteps coming in his direction. Panic seized him, and he ran. He no longer cared about being quiet. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between himself and those men. Behind him, he heard shouts of alarm. They had spotted him. He ran like he'd never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs. Branches whipped at his face, leaving stinging cuts, but he didn't slow down. He could hear them pursuing him, their heavy footfalls and angry shouts spurring him on. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under his feet. He had run straight off the edge of a steep incline. He tumbled down the slope, his world a dizzying blur of earth and sky. He came to a jarring stop at the bottom, the breath knocked out of him. For a moment, he lay there dazed, gasping for air. Then he heard the voices again, closer now. Ignoring the pain radiating through his body, he forced himself to his feet and started running again. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees a green blur. He had no idea how long he'd been running or how far he'd gone. His throat was raw, his mouth dry as dust. But still, he pushed on. Just when he thought he couldn't take another step, he burst out of the tree line and onto a road. An actual paved road. He could have wept with relief, but he wasn't safe yet. He could still hear shouts in the distance. They were still after him. He looked up and down the road, praying for a car, a truck, anything. But it was deserted. Left with no other choice, he started running down the road. It had to lead somewhere, right? To civilization, to safety. He didn't know how long he ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. His whole world narrowed down to the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the asphalt and the burning in his lungs. And then, like a mirage in the desert, he saw it. A gas station. Never in his life had he been so happy to see one of those garish neon signs. He staggered into the parking lot, startling an old man filling up his pickup truck. "Please," he gasped out, his voice hoarse. I need help. Call the police." The man took one look at him, wild-eyed, covered in cuts and bruises, gasping for breath, and hurried into the store. Moments later, he came back out with the clerk, who was already on the phone with 911. As Ethan sank to the ground, his legs finally giving out, he heard the clerk describing his condition to the dispatcher. The old man draped his jacket over Ethan's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort. It wasn't until he heard the wail of approaching sirens that he finally allowed himself to relax. He was safe. He had made it. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and medical checks. He told the authorities everything he had seen, and they assured him they would investigate. They found the lab, abandoned but with clear evidence of recent activity. The men, however, had vanished. It took Ethan a long time to feel comfortable in the woods again. The forest, once his sanctuary, had become a place of terror. But slowly he found his way back. He still hikes, still seeks out the solitude of nature. But now he's always aware that even in the most remote places, you're never truly alone. And sometimes that's not a comforting thought at all. The midnight intruder, when I was around 12, thinking of nothing but emptying my bladder and returning to bed. That's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. There was a man standing by the other bathroom door, staring at me. He was dressed in a tattered gray jumpsuit and had a crutch. I don't recall how I got to my parents' room, but suddenly I was there, hysterical. My dad got up and went to the bathroom and kitchen to look around. He didn't find anything but allowed me to sleep on the couch in their room. I didn't fall back asleep. About an hour later, I heard the sliding door to the bathroom from my sister's room open, followed by limping footsteps. The next morning, my dad searched around again and noticed that the fridge and pantry had been raided. I have no idea who that person was, and I never saw him again. Night terrors at Westfield Mall. The flickering fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow over the deserted corridors of Westfield Mall as David made his rounds. It was just another quiet night, or so he thought. Little did he know that in a matter of hours, he'd be fighting for his life against unseen adversaries in a place he once considered utterly mundane. David had been the night security guard at Westfield for the past 3 years. It was usually a monotonous job: patrol the mall, check the locks, make sure no one was trying to sleep in the food court. But tonight, something felt different. It started like any other shift. He arrived at 10 p.m., just as the last of the cleaning crew were leaving. He exchanged nods with Martha, the elderly woman who always stayed late to ensure the floors were spotless. "All quiet tonight, David," she'd said with a smile. "See you tomorrow." If only she knew. He settled into the security office, a cramped room filled with monitors displaying feeds from the mall's numerous security cameras. A quick scan showed nothing out of the ordinary. Empty hallways and darkened storefronts. Perfect. Around midnight, he began his first patrol. The mall was eerily silent, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. He'd never admit it to anyone, but these late-night walks always gave him the creeps. There was something unsettling about the mannequins in the darkened shop windows, their blank eyes seeming to follow him as he passed. He was on the second floor, passing the large fountain in the central atrium, when he heard a faint metallic scraping sound. He froze, straining his ears. There it was again. "Hello?" he called out, his voice amplified in the emptiness. No response. He pulled out his flashlight, its beam sweeping across the darkened stores. Nothing seemed amiss. "Must be the old ventilation system," he muttered, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. He continued his rounds, but now with heightened awareness. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the building amplified in the silence. By the time he returned to the security office, his nerves were frayed. He sank into his chair, eyes glued to the monitors. Everything appeared normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when he saw it, a fleeting shadow darting across one of the camera feeds. He leaned closer, heart pounding. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving him wondering if he'd imagined it. He rewound the footage, watching intently. There, in the corner of the screen, a figure dashed past, too quick to make out any details. His mouth went dry. Someone was in the mall. He grabbed his radio, ready to call for backup, but hesitated. What if he was overreacting? He didn't want to be the guard who called in the cops over a shadow. He decided to investigate himself. Armed with his flashlight and a heavy wrench he kept in the office for emergencies, he ventured back into the mall. The corridors seemed different now, menacing. Every storefront could be concealing an intruder, every shadow a potential threat. He moved cautiously, ears straining for any sound. As he rounded a corner near the electronics store, he heard it again, the scraping sound, louder this time. It was coming from inside the store. He approached slowly, flashlight beam trembling. The store's security gate was down, but as he got closer, he saw it wasn't fully closed. There was a gap at the bottom, just large enough for someone to slip through. His heart hammered in his chest. He should turn back, call the police, but curiosity and a misplaced sense of duty pushed him forward. He ducked under the gate, the metallic screech it made echoing in the silence. The store was pitch black, the displays of TVs and computers looming like silent sentinels. His flashlight beam seemed pathetically weak in the overwhelming darkness. "Security!" he called out, trying to maintain a steady voice. "Show yourself." Silence. Then, a crash from the back of the store. He swung his flashlight towards the sound, catching a glimpse of movement. Someone was definitely in there. He moved deeper into the store, wrench gripped tightly in his sweaty hand. Another crash, closer this time. He spun around, but saw nothing. They were playing with him, he realized. Whoever they were enjoying this game of cat and mouse. Suddenly, the lights flickered on. He blinked, momentarily blinded. When his vision cleared, he saw them, 3 men dressed in black, their faces obscured by ski masks, They were spread out, blocking his exit. One held a crowbar, another a knife. Well, the one in the middle said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Looks like we have company, boys." David raised his wrench, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. "You're trespassing," he said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. "Leave now, and I won't call the cops." They laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the store. "I don't think you understand the situation, friend," the leader said. "We're not going anywhere, and neither are you." They started to advance, fanning out to surround him. David backed up, his mind racing. He was outnumbered and outarmed. He needed a plan, and fast. His back hit a display stand, and an idea sparked. He grabbed a laptop from the stand and hurled it at the nearest intruder. The man ducked, and in that moment of distraction, David ran. He darted between the aisles, knocking over displays to slow them down. He could hear them cursing, giving chase. He reached the security gate and slid under, not stopping to catch his breath. He sprinted through the mall, the sounds of pursuit close behind. He needed to reach the security office to call for help, but they were between him and the office. He took a sharp turn, heading for the service corridors. If he could lose them in the maze of back hallways, he might have a chance. The service door slammed shut behind him as he entered the narrow corridor. It was darker here, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows. He ran, taking random turns, hoping to throw off his pursuers. Left, right, another right. He was quickly lost in the labyrinthine corridors, but he could still hear them, their footsteps echoing relentlessly. He found himself in the mall's basement, surrounded by hulking machinery, generators, HVAC systems, water heaters. The noise was deafening, masking any sounds of pursuit. He crouched behind a large boiler, trying to catch his breath and think. He needed to get to a phone, but his radio was back in the security office, and his cell phone was in his locker. He was on his own. A noise to his left made him freeze. One of them was close, searching methodically. He could see the intruder's flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. He held his breath as the beam passed inches from his hiding spot. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he'd been seen, but the light moved on. He waited until he could no longer hear the footsteps, then started to move again. He had to get back upstairs, find a way out. He crept through the basement, every nerve on high alert. He'd almost made it to the stairs when a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun around, swinging his wrench blindly. It connected with something solid, and he heard a grunt of pain. He didn't wait to see who he'd hit. He ran, taking the stairs two at a time. He burst back into the main mall, shouts echoing behind him. They were all after him now. He ran faster than he ever had before, his lungs burning, legs pumping. He rounded a corner and saw it, the exit. Freedom. He slammed into the door at full speed, already imagining the cool night air on his face. But the door didn't budge. It was locked. Of course it was locked. He had locked it himself at the start of his shift. Panic threatened to overwhelm him as he fumbled for his keys. Behind him, he could hear them closing in. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the lock. "Turn, damn you, turn." Just as he heard them round the corner, the lock clicked. He yanked the door open and burst out into the night. He sprinted across the parking lot, not daring to look back. He didn't stop until he reached the all-night diner across the street. He stumbled inside, startling the lone waitress. "Call the police," he gasped. "Please." The next few hours were a blur of police statements and questions. They searched the mall, but found no sign of the intruders, just some overturned displays in the electronics store and a discarded crowbar. David quit his job the next day. He couldn't face going back into that mall, couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. Sometimes, late at night, he still wakes up in a cold sweat, the echo of footsteps ringing in his ears, and he wonders what if he hadn't made it to that door in time. The man in the mask. "I used to live in a rented house across the street from a fairly busy city park. At night, when the park was deserted, I would often sit on my porch and enjoy the quiet. One night, Around 1 a.m., I opened the front door and was about to sit down when I saw a man standing in the park, directly in front of my house. He was dressed all in black and wore a mask. The mask was just a plain white face, and it was incredibly creepy to look at. The sight of this guy sent chills down my spine. He didn't move at all, although I knew he was watching me. The entire neighborhood was silent and still, and we just stood there, looking at each other. We watched each other for a long time, and then he suddenly walked away. I ended up calling the police because I figured this guy was casing the neighborhood or something. The cops came and took my statement. A couple of months later, I was doing some yard work around the side of my house. I was pulling a huge tangle of weeds out from a thicket underneath my kitchen window when I saw something that looked like trash. I picked it up and looked at it. It was the mask that the man was wearing that night. Whispers in the Ozarks. The crackling flames of our campfire did little to dispel the eerie silence that had fallen over the Ozark forest. What had started as a peaceful anniversary getaway for Ben and Ashley had taken a sinister turn. As Ben stared into the darkness beyond the small circle of light, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Little did he know their idyllic camping trip was about to become a desperate fight for survival. Ben had always been drawn to the wilderness. When he suggested to Ashley that they celebrate their anniversary with a weekend camping trip deep in the Ozarks, far from the usual tourist trails, she was enthusiastic. They craved solitude, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. Be careful what you wish for, Ben thought grimly. The first day had been idyllic. They hiked through lush forests, the canopy above alive with birdsong. They set up their tent in a secluded clearing near a gurgling stream, the sound of the water a soothing backdrop to their quiet conversations. As night fell, they sat by the campfire, roasting marshmallows and identifying constellations in the clear sky. It was on the second day that things started to feel off. They were exploring a nearby ridge when Ashley stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. Ben listened, but heard nothing beyond the usual forest sounds. "Hear what?" "I thought I heard voices," she said, her eyes scanning the trees around them, like someone shouting. Ben strained his ears, but still nothing. "Probably just other hikers," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But a knot of unease had formed in his stomach. They continued their hike, but the carefree mood had evaporated. Ben found himself jumping at every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush. Ashley stayed close, her earlier excitement replaced by nervous glances over her shoulder. As they made their way back to camp, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every time he turned to look, he saw nothing but trees and shadows, yet the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each step. They reached their clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. But even the breathtaking sunset couldn't dispel the unease that had settled over them. "Maybe we should pack up and head back," Ashley suggested as they prepared a meager dinner. "I've got a bad feeling about this place." Ben was tempted to agree, but pride held him back. "Let's stick it out one more night," he said. "It's probably just our imaginations." But even as he said the words, he wasn't convinced. As darkness enveloped the forest, they huddled close to the campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid of being overheard. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, sent their hearts racing. It was just after midnight when they heard it, a long, low whistle, followed by an answering call from the opposite side of the clearing. Ashley gripped Ben's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "Ben," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's someone out there." Before Ben could respond, a figure stepped into the firelight. A man, tall and lanky, with a scraggly beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He held a hunting rifle loosely in his hands. Well, he drawled, his voice rough. "Looks like we got company, boys." As if on cue, more men emerged from the darkness. Ben counted 5 in total, all armed, all staring at them with a mixture of curiosity and something darker, more predatory. Ben stood up slowly, pulling Ashley with him. "We don't want any trouble," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're just passing through. We'll pack up and leave right now." The first man, clearly the leader, chuckled. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "Oh, I don't think so," he said. "See, we got ourselves a little operation out here, and we can't have you two running off and telling tales." Ben's mind raced. What kind of operation? Then it hit him: drugs. They must have stumbled upon some illegal grow operation or meth lab. "We haven't seen anything," Ashley said, her voice high with fear. "We don't even know where we are. Please just let us go." The leader pretended to consider this for a moment, then shook his head. "Can't take that risk, sweetheart." "Nope. I'm afraid you'll be staying with us for a while." The other men started to move closer, forming a tight circle around them. Ben looked around desperately for an escape route, but they were surrounded. That's when he saw it, a glint of metal in the firelight. One of the men had pulled out a coil of rope. In that instant, survival instinct took over. Ben grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it at the nearest man. He yelled in pain and surprise as embers scattered across his clothes. "Run!" Ben shouted to Ashley, pushing her towards the darkest part of the forest. They took off, crashing through the underbrush. Behind them, Ben could hear shouts of anger and the sounds of pursuit. His heart hammered in his chest, his lungs burning. They ran blindly through the dark forest, branches whipping at their faces, roots threatening to trip them. Ben had no idea where they were going, only that they had to put as much distance as possible between them and those men. Ashley stumbled, and Ben caught her before she could fall. "Keep going," he gasped, pulling her along. "We can't stop." The sounds of their pursuers seemed to be getting closer. They knew these woods better than Ben and Ashley did, and they were gaining on them. Just when Ben thought they couldn't run any further, they burst out of the tree line and found themselves at the edge of a steep ravine. The stream they had camped near had carved a deep gully into the earth, the water now a rushing torrent far below. "What do we do?" Ashley cried, her eyes wide with fear. Ben looked back at the forest, saw flashlight beams dancing between the trees. They were almost upon them. "We have to jump," he said, gesturing to the other side of the ravine. It wasn't too wide, maybe 10 feet across. They could make it. They had to. Ashley looked at him like he was crazy, but the sound of voices growing ever closer made up her mind. She nodded. "On 3, Ben said, gripping her hand tightly. 1, 2, 3. They leaped together, the ground disappearing beneath their feet. For a heart-stopping moment, they were suspended in the air, the roar of the water below drowning out all other sounds. Then they hit the other side, rolling to break their fall. Pain shot through Ben's ankle, but adrenaline kept him moving. He pulled Ashley to her feet, and they staggered into the cover of the trees. Behind them, Ben heard shouts of frustration. They had reached the ravine, but it had bought them precious time. They kept moving, pushing their exhausted bodies to their limits. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and desperate flight. Every sound had them freezing in terror, certain they were about to be discovered. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they finally heard what they had been praying for, the distant sound of traffic. They had reached a road. Stumbling out of the forest, they flagged down the first car they saw, an old pickup truck driven by a kindly farmer. They babbled out their story as he drove them to the nearest police station. The authorities took their statement and sent out search parties, but they never found any trace of the men or their operation. Maybe they had cleared out, knowing Ben and Ashley would report them. It took a long time for the nightmares to stop, for them to feel safe again. Ben and Ashley were still together, their bond strengthened by their shared ordeal. But they didn't go camping anymore. Some scars run too deep. Some fears are too primal to ever fully shake off. Sometimes, when Ben is lying awake at night, he can still hear those whistles echoing through the trees, still feel the terror of being hunted. And he wonders about those dark forests, about what other secrets they might be hiding, waiting to be stumbled upon by unsuspecting campers looking for a peaceful getaway. The Horsehead Masks. I was on vacation in Hawaii with my family. exploring a sparsely populated area of the Big Island. We pulled off the main road to check out a supposedly stunning sunset spot. It was getting late, twilight time, and we finally reached the location. There were 2 other cars in the parking lot, both older, rusty-looking trucks. We figured they were probably there for the sunset as well. So we got out of our car and started looking around. I happened to glance back at the trucks and noticed something truly bizarre. In the front seat of both vehicles were 2 people wearing horsehead masks. They weren't saying anything, not moving, just sitting there. I thought, okay, that's really weird, and I tapped my mom on the shoulder to point it out. She glanced over and saw what I did. My dad just laughed it off, claiming they were probably just prankster teenagers. I waited a few more minutes, glancing back at them, before saying that I was getting really creeped out and wanted to leave. My mom agreed, so we started heading back to our car. I looked back at the trucks, and the windows had rolled down on the side facing us. The people in the masks had turned and were staring at us as we walked. We got back in our car and started to leave. I looked behind us, and the people had leaned out of their windows and were watching us, still wearing the masks. The road was dirt and full of potholes, so it was slow going. After a few minutes of driving, they appeared behind us. I looked back, and they were all still wearing their masks, just staring. We got back on the main road and drove away from the house we were renting, but they followed us. The nearest police station was about half an hour away, but we drove to it. To our relief, when we pulled in, they kept going, but they all turned to look at us as they went past slowly, all of them still wearing those masks. We waited for about an hour at the station and eventually went back to the house after we were sure they were gone. I spent the rest of the vacation terrified that they would somehow show up again, that they had been following us. I have no idea who they were or what they were all about. Maybe some locals having a laugh at tourists by creeping them out, or maybe something worse. The hitchhiker. The highway stretched out before Frank, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate landscape. He'd been driving for hours, the monotony broken only by the occasional flicker of his headlights as they caught a road sign or the startled eyes of a nocturnal animal. He never expected that picking up a stranger would turn his routine haul into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened on that moonless night in the middle of nowhere. Frank had been a long-haul trucker for the better part of 2 decades. He'd seen his fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing could have prepared him for what was to come. It was just past midnight, and he was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from Los Angeles to Denver. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show host droning on about conspiracy theories. Frank chuckled to himself, thinking how some people would believe anything. That's when he saw him, a lone figure on the shoulder of the road, thumb outstretched, hoping for a ride. Now, Frank wasn't usually one for picking up hitchhikers. Too many risks, too many stories of things gone wrong. But something about this guy made him slow down. Maybe it was the late hour, or the fact that they were miles from civilization, or maybe it was just the loneliness of the open road. He pulled over, the air brakes hissing as the truck rumbled to a stop. The man jogged up to the passenger side, and Frank leaned over to unlock the door. "Where you headed?" he asked as the man climbed in. "East," the man replied simply. "As far as you're going." Frank took him in as he settled into the seat. He was younger than Frank, maybe in his early 30s, with a lean build, close-cropped hair, and intense eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had a small duffel bag that he clutched protectively on his lap. "Name's Frank," the trucker said, pulling back onto the highway. "Peter," the hitchhiker replied, not offering to shake hands. They drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Frank tried to make conversation, asking Peter where he was from, what he did for a living, but his answers were short, evasive. After a while, Frank gave up and focused on the road. It was about an hour later that he first noticed something was off. Peter had been fidgeting in his seat, constantly checking the side and rearview mirrors. At first, Frank thought he was just nervous about hitching a ride with a stranger, but then he caught Peter glancing at him, a calculating look in his eyes that sent a shiver down Frank's spine. "Everything okay?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Fine," Peter said a little too quickly, just not used to being in a truck this big. Frank nodded, but he didn't believe him. His instincts, honed by years on the road, were screaming that something wasn't right. They were passing through a particularly desolate stretch of highway when Peter suddenly spoke up. "Pull over," he said, his voice tight. "What?" Frank asked, confused. "Pull over. Now." Frank glanced at him and felt his blood run cold. Peter had a gun in his hand, pointed straight at him. Frank's mind raced. Was this a robbery? Was he going to be killed and left on the side of the road? He thought about his wife back home, about their kids. Would he ever see them again? "Look, man," Frank said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If you want money, I've got some cash in my wallet. Just take it and go. No need for this to get ugly." Peter laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "This isn't about money, Frank. This is about survival. Now pull over before I decide to redecorate your cab with your brains." Frank did as he was told, guiding the massive truck onto the shoulder. As soon as they came to a stop, Peter was in motion. He reached across Frank and snatched the keys from the ignition. "Get out," he ordered, gesturing with the gun. Frank climbed out of the cab, his legs feeling like jelly. Peter followed, keeping the gun trained on him. "What do you want?" Frank asked, hating how his voice shook. "I need your truck," Peter said, "and I need you to drive it." "Drive it where?" "You'll know when we get there. Now get back in." "You're driving." As Frank climbed back into the driver's seat, his mind was working overtime. He needed to find a way out of this situation. Maybe if he could distract Peter, he could make a grab for the gun. Or maybe he could intentionally drive erratically, try to attract the attention of a highway patrol car. But as if reading his thoughts, Peter spoke up. "Don't try anything stupid, Frank. I've got nothing to lose." "Which means you've got everything to lose. Just drive normally and do what I say." So Frank drove. Hours passed, the landscape outside changing as they headed east. All the while, Peter kept the gun trained on him, his eyes constantly scanning the road behind them. "Who are you running from?" Frank finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Peter was quiet for so long that Frank thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Bad people," he said softly. "People who want me dead." "Why?" He laughed again, that same humorless sound. "Because I know things. Things they don't want anyone to know." Frank's mind raced with possibilities. Was he some kind of whistleblower? A witness to a crime? Whatever it was, he was now involved, whether he wanted to be or not. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Peter suddenly tensed. He muttered something under his breath, staring intently at the side mirror. Frank glanced in his own mirror and saw a black SUV gaining on them fast. "Drive faster," Peter ordered, his knuckles white around the gun. Frank pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as they picked up speed. But the SUV was faster, sleeker, pulled alongside them, and Frank saw the passenger window roll down. "Get down," Peter yelled, just as the sound of gunfire erupted. Frank ducked instinctively, feeling the truck swerve as bullets pinged off the metal. Peter was returning fire, leaning out the window to shoot at their pursuers. The next few minutes were chaos. Frank struggled to keep the truck on the road while trying to stay low. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the confined space of the cab. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the truck lurched violently. They had shot out one of the tires. Frank fought with the steering wheel, trying to keep them from jackknifing. "There!" Peter shouted, pointing ahead. "Pull into that rest stop." Frank saw the sign for the upcoming rest area and made for it, the truck swaying dangerously on its blown tire. They skidded into the parking lot, coming to a stop in a cloud of dust and burning rubber. "Run!" Peter yelled, already jumping out of the cab. Frank didn't need to be told twice. He was out of the truck and running before he even had time to think. He could hear car doors slamming behind them, shouts of anger. They ran towards the small cluster of buildings that made up the rest stop. It was early, and the place was deserted. They burst into the main building, startling a sleepy-looking attendant. "Call the police," Frank gasped out. "There are men with guns." But before he could finish, the door burst open again. 3 men entered, all holding weapons. The attendant screamed and ducked behind the counter. Peter shoved Frank behind a rack of snacks and opened fire. The men returned fire, and suddenly the quiet rest stop was transformed into a war zone. Chip bags exploded, sending a rain of potato shards everywhere. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Frank cowered behind the rack, his heart pounding. This was insane. How had his normal night turned into this? The gunfight seemed to last forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, silence fell. Frank peered around the edge of the rack. Peter was still standing, his gun still raised. The 3 men were on the ground, not moving. Frank felt bile rise in his throat and had to swallow hard to keep from throwing up. In the distance, he could hear sirens approaching. Someone, probably the attendant, had managed to call the police. Peter turned to Frank, his face grim. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Before Frank could respond, he was gone, running out the back door of the rest stop. Frank thought about following him, but his legs wouldn't move. He just sat there, surrounded by the debris of the gunfight, waiting for the police to arrive. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and questions. He told them everything about picking up Peter, about the chase, about the shootout. They seemed skeptical at first, but the evidence backed up his story. It turned out Peter was indeed running from something dangerous, though the exact details remained murky. Frank was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the experience changed him. He still drives his routes, still hauls his loads across the country, but he's more cautious now, more aware of the darkness that can lurk behind a friendly face. And he never, ever picks up hitchhikers anymore. The hitchhiking incident. This story is about my mother, Evelyn. Before she met my father, she was going through a separation and was essentially on her own, trying to get back to where her family lived. She has fond memories of some of the people she met during that time and even uses those encounters to convince me that people are generally good, which I often disagree with. However, there was one particular occasion that made her stop hitchhiking. She was in a car with someone who turned down a road that raised her suspicions. The kind of road that was dark, isolated, unpaved, in the middle of nowhere. As he was driving down this road, my mom asked, "Where are we going?" He didn't respond. The guy pulled the car to a stop and got out. As he was walking around to her side of the car, she put her backpack between herself and the door. He opened the door, and she pushed the backpack into his chest and jumped out through the driver's side door. She explained that she basically ran into the woods and hid behind a tree. The guy kind of walked around aimlessly through the woods for what she described as an eternity. Eventually, he got back into his car and left. She told me this story when I was about 10 or 11 years old. While people are usually fearful of the crazy hitchhikers, she explained the side most people tend to overlook. Breakdown. The first sign of trouble was the sputtering of Amelia's car engine, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine on that lonely stretch of highway. As the vehicle lurched to a halt, she had no idea that this breakdown would be the beginning of a nightmarish encounter, a terrifying ordeal that would test her will to survive. Amelia had always prided herself on being independent and resourceful, but on that fateful night, those qualities would be pushed to their limits. She was on her way home from a weekend trip, the long drive stretching out before her under the vast expanse of a moonless night sky. The highway was deserted, with only the occasional pair of headlights appearing in the distance. That's when her trusty old car, Betsy, decided she'd had enough. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally gave out with a groan, the car rolling to a stop on the narrow shoulder. "No, no, no," Amelia muttered, turning the key in the ignition repeatedly, but to no avail. Not even a click. She slumped back in her seat, trying to calm her racing heart. She was in the middle of nowhere, her cell phone useless with no signal. The darkness outside seemed to press in on all sides, broken only by the dim glow of her dashboard lights. Taking a deep breath, she got out of the car and popped the hood, hoping against hope that it might be something simple, something she could fix. But as soon as she saw the jumble of wires and hoses, her heart sank. Or at least let her use their phone. The vehicle, an old pickup truck, slowed as it neared, pulled over, and a man got out. In the dim light, Amelia could see he was middle-aged, with a weathered face and calloused hands. He wore faded jeans and a plaid shirt, looking every bit the part of a friendly local. "Car trouble?" he called out, walking towards her. "Yeah," Amelia replied, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "It just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about engines?" He chuckled. "Might know a thing or two. Mind if I take a look?" Amelia stepped aside, allowing him to peer under the hood. He poked around for a few minutes, making thoughtful noises. "Well, looks like your fuel pump's gone," he finally declared. "Not something we can fix out here, I'm afraid." Amelia's heart sank. "I don't suppose you have a cell phone I could borrow? Mine's not getting any service out here." He shook his head. "Sorry, Mom. Don't own one of those fancy contraptions. But tell you what, I can give you a ride to the nearest town. There's a mechanic there who should be able to help you out." Amelia hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to get into a car with a stranger, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But what choice did she have? She couldn't stay here all night, and who knew when another car might pass by. "That would be great, thank you," she heard herself say. "Happy to help. Name's Robert, by the way." "Amelia," she replied, grabbing her purse from the car. As they drove, Robert kept up a steady stream of small talk. He asked about where she was from, where she was headed. Amelia answered vaguely, not wanting to give away too much information. Something about him was making her increasingly uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on why. They had been driving for about 20 minutes when Amelia realized something was wrong. They should have reached a town by now, or at least seen some sign of civilization. But there was nothing but darkness outside the windows. How much further is it to town?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Robert glanced at her, and this time there was no mistaking the coldness in his eyes. "Oh, we're not going to town, Amelia." Amelia's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Where are we going?" He didn't answer, just pressed down harder on the accelerator. The truck picked up speed, the engine roaring as it ate up the empty road. Panic surged through Amelia. She reached for the door handle, but it was locked. Child locks, she realized with a growing sense of dread. "Please," she said, her voice shaking, "just let me out. I won't tell anyone, I swear." Robert laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that made her skin crawl. "Oh, I know you won't tell anyone. No one ever does." The implication of his words hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't the first time he had done this. How many other stranded motorists had he picked up, promising help, only to... Amelia couldn't even finish the thought. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way out. She could try to grab the wheel, force them off the road, but at this speed it would likely kill them both. She could try to reason with him, appeal to his humanity, but the cold gleam in his eyes told her that was a lost cause. As they sped through the night, Robert started talking again, but this time his words chilled her to the bone. "You know, Amelia," he said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather, "you really shouldn't trust strangers. Bad things happen to girls who aren't careful." He paused, then added, "But don't you worry, it'll all be over soon." Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes, but she blinked them back. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Suddenly, an idea struck her. It was risky, potentially fatal, but it was her only chance. She started coughing violently, doubling over in her seat. "What the hell?" Robert said, glancing at her. Amelia continued coughing, making choking noises. "Can't breathe," she gasped out. Robert looked uncertain. "Hey, cut that out," he said, but Amelia could hear a note of concern in his voice. She slumped in her seat, her coughs turning into wheezes. She closed her eyes, letting her body go limp. Robert swore under his breath. The truck began to slow down. Amelia felt the vehicle pull over to the side of the road. Robert put it in park and leaned over her. "Hey, wake up," he said, shaking her shoulder roughly. This was her chance. Her eyes snapped open, and she drove her elbow into his face with all her strength. She felt his nose crunch under the impact, and he reeled back with a howl of pain. In that moment of distraction, she lunged for the keys in the ignition. She yanked them out and scrambled for the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. Robert recovered quickly, grabbing for her. His fingers tangled in her hair, yanking her back. Amelia screamed, more in rage than fear, and twisted in his grip. Her free hand found his eyes, and she dug her fingers in. He let go with a scream of agony, and Amelia tumbled out of the truck onto the hard ground. Pain shot through her, but adrenaline kept her moving. She scrambled to her feet and ran. She could hear Robert behind her, cursing and stumbling, but she had the advantage now. Her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and she was younger, faster. She ran like she had never run before, her lungs burning, her legs pumping. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The keys were still clutched in her hand, cutting into her palm. She didn't know how long she ran. Eventually, she couldn't hear Robert anymore, but she didn't slow down. The night was alive with noises, the rustling of wind through the trees, the hooting of an owl, but to her terrified mind, every sound was Robert, coming back to finish what he'd started. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, she saw it, lights in the distance. A town, or at least a gas station. Civilization. Safety. With a final burst of energy, she sprinted towards the lights. As she got closer, she could make out the shape of a small, all-night gas station. A beacon of hope in the vast darkness. She burst through the door, startling the attendant behind the counter. "Please," she gasped. "Call the police. There's a man." He tried to. She couldn't finish the sentence, the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright suddenly draining away. She sank to the floor, the events of the night finally catching up with her. The attendant, to his credit, didn't hesitate. He grabbed the phone and dialed 911, while keeping a wary eye on the door. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights a welcome sight. Amelia told them everything, describing Robert and his truck in as much detail as she could remember. They found him a few hours later, still trying to fix his flat tire on the side of the road. As it turned out, Amelia wasn't his first victim. The police investigation uncovered a string of disappearances linked to Robert, all women traveling alone. He was a predator, preying on the vulnerable under the guise of helpfulness. Amelia was lucky. Apart from some cuts and bruises, she was physically unharmed. The mental scars took longer to heal. For months afterwards, she couldn't drive at night without breaking into a cold sweat. Every truck on the highway made her heart race, but she survived. She had outsmarted a predator and lived to tell the tale. And if her story could serve as a warning to others, to trust their instincts and be wary of seemingly harmless strangers, then maybe some good could come from that terrifying night. The last time I hitchhiked, when I was 17, I didn't have a driver's license and walked most places. Occasionally, I'd catch rides with friends, and less often, I'd hitchhike. The night in question was one of those rare occasions when I decided to hitchhike, having worked late and being too exhausted to walk home. Now, most of the time when I hitchhiked, I wouldn't get in the car with a lone man, only women or rarely men with a girl or kids in the car. This night, though, cars were few and far between, and it was very cold. And honestly, when he pulled over, I took a good look at the driver and figured I could take him if he tried anything. He was on the slender side and had a strange frailness about him. I got into the car after we agreed on a destination. We exchanged names. His was Arthur, and I warmed my fingers in front of a heating vent. He spoke quietly, asking a few questions like if I was a local and how I liked living there. He said he'd only been there a couple of months but found it beautiful and hoped he could find happiness there. That comment struck me as a little odd. It kind of made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. It began to snow, and the road quickly got slippery, so he slowed down and kept his eyes on the road, driving silently. I was okay with that, as small talk was never my forte. About 10 minutes later, I noticed a car near the intersection that we were approaching. It seemed to be sliding, so I said, "Watch out." He immediately hit the gas, shooting through the intersection, and burst out with, "Don't you ever raise your voice at me again." Needless to say, I was taken aback. I responded, "Look, this is close enough, just pull over here and I can walk the rest of the way." He didn't seem to hear me. "Arthur, did you hear me? I said you can pull over here and I can just walk." No response. He just stared straight ahead, driving faster now than he had been since it began to snow. To say I was scared doesn't seem to cover the depth of fear that began to rise inside me. I didn't know if I should stay quiet or speak, but I damn sure wasn't going to raise my voice again. After about a mile, he began to mumble under his breath. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but I assumed he was speaking to me, so I said, "I'm sorry, I can't hear you." He began to speak a little louder and more rapidly, saying things like, "You're always yelling at me. I've told you time and again, I do not appreciate being yelled at, but do you listen? No. You're always yelling at me. Well, I'm done listening to you now. Do you hear that? I'm done." I was at a complete loss. I didn't know what to say in response or if I should say anything at all. I contemplated jumping out of the car, but nixed that idea when I realized the door lock was missing. There was just a silver-lined hole where it should have been. My eyes began to water, and I debated causing an accident by grabbing the wheel and hoping for the best when he suddenly looked at me for the first time since I had gotten into the car. He blinked several times rapidly and then slowed the car, pulling into a gas station. I waited to see if he would unlock the doors, not wanting to say anything to set him off again. After a minute or two, he quietly said, "I think I better let you out here," and hit the button to unlock the doors. I wasn't about to hesitate. I jumped out of the car as if it were on fire. I was about to turn and walk into the gas station when he called my name. He looked so damn sad that I hesitated. He apologized, said he was sorry if he frightened me, that he never would have harmed me, and asked if I'd be able to get home okay. I said yes, that I would, and closed the door. He began to pull out of the gas station lot, but then stopped suddenly. He just sat there for a minute, his head down. I froze, wondering what the hell he was doing, and was about to run into the station when he rolled down his window and yelled out to me, waving something in his hand. It was my hat. I had left it on the seat. I approached his side of the car, and he handed it to me, apologizing again. I didn't know what else to say, so I just said, "Thank you." I watched as he drove off, making sure he was out of sight before moving on, so he wouldn't know which direction I was walking. I had decided to go towards a friend's house instead of home. As I walked, I went to put my hat back on, and out fell a piece of paper. Folded into the paper was a $100 bill. The paper said, "I'm sorry. Please take a cab and don't ever hitchhike again. Some people want to kill you and they don't know why." That was, in fact, the last time I ever hitchhiked. Secrets in the ruins. The crumbling facade of the abandoned Millbrook factory loomed before us, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. We were just a group of friends looking for a thrill, urban explorers seeking the perfect backdrop for some edgy photos. Little did we know we were about to stumble into a nightmare, a desperate fight for survival that would change us forever. My name is Chris, and I've always been fascinated by abandoned places. There's a certain allure to the decay, the way nature slowly reclaims what man has left behind. So when my friends and I heard about the old Millbrook factory on the outskirts of town, we knew we had to check it out. There were 5 of us that day, me, my best friend Liam, his girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Emily and Noah. We'd done this kind of thing before, exploring old buildings and forgotten places, but never somewhere quite this big or this isolated. As we approached the factory, a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension filled me. The chain-link fence surrounding the property was rusted and mangled, easy enough to slip through. We made our way across the overgrown parking lot, our footsteps crunching on broken glass and weeds. "This place is creepy as hell," Emily whispered, her camera already out, snapping pictures. "That's the point, isn't it?" Noah grinned, but I could see he was a bit on edge too. We found a side door hanging precariously off its hinges and slipped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. Shafts of sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes. "Let's split up," Liam suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but everyone else seemed eager, so we agreed to meet back at the entrance in an hour and set off in different directions. I ventured deeper into the factory, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The place was a labyrinth of rusted machinery and collapsed shelving. Every step echoed ominously, and more than once I startled myself with my own reflection in a grimy window. I was in what looked like an old office area when I heard it, a shuffling sound, too heavy to be a rat or a bird. I froze, my heart pounding. "Guys!" I called out, my voice echoing in the vast space. No answer. I turned slowly, sweeping my flashlight around the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving quickly past a doorway at the end of the hall. It was too large to be any of my friends. Fear gripped me, but curiosity won out. I moved towards the doorway, every sense on high alert. As I reached the threshold, I heard voices low, rough whispers that definitely didn't belong to any of my friends. I peered around the corner, and my blood ran cold. In what must have been the factory's main floor, I saw 3 men gathered around a collection of crates, passing packages between them. Even from a distance, I knew what I was witnessing. A drug deal. I must have made a noise, a gasp, or a shuffle of my feet, because suddenly one of the men looked up. Our eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Then all hell broke loose. "Hey!" the man shouted, reaching for something at his waist. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran. I could hear shouts and footsteps behind me as I tore through the factory, my mind racing. I needed to find my friends, warn them. We needed to get out of there. I rounded a corner and slammed right into Liam. We both went down in a tangle of limbs. "Chris, what the hell, man?" Liam groaned, rubbing his head. "No time," I gasped, scrambling to my feet. "We need to go now. Where are the others?" The urgency in my voice must have gotten through to him because he didn't ask any questions. "Sarah's just down there," he pointed. "I don't know where Emily and Noah went." We found Sarah quickly, and I gave them a rushed explanation as we hurried through the factory. Their eyes widened in fear as they realized the danger we were in. "We need to find Emily and Noah," Sarah said, her voice trembling. I nodded, but before we could formulate a plan, we heard a scream. It was Emily. We ran towards the sound, caution forgotten in our desperation to reach our friend. We burst into a large room and saw Emily backed into a corner, one of the men advancing on her with a menacing glint in his eyes. Noah was on the ground, unmoving. Without thinking, I grabbed a piece of rusted pipe from the floor and charged. I caught the man off guard, swinging the pipe and connecting with his shoulder. He went down with a yell of pain. "Run!" I shouted to Emily. She didn't need to be told twice. Liam was checking on Noah. "He's breathing," he reported. "I think he's just knocked out." The man I'd hit was getting to his feet, murder in his eyes. Behind him, I could see his 2 companions entering the room. "You kids picked the wrong place to play explorer," one of them growled. We were trapped. The only exit was behind the men, and they were blocking our path. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. That's when I saw it, a conveyor belt leading up to a higher level. If we could get up there, maybe we could find another way out. "The belt," I hissed to Liam. "We need to get up there." He nodded, understanding immediately. "On 3, he whispered. 1, 2, 3. We moved as one. Liam and I grabbed Noah under the arms and ran for the conveyor belt. Sarah and Emily were right behind us. The men, caught off guard by our sudden movement, hesitated for a crucial second. We scrambled up the rusted conveyor belt, the sharp edges cutting into our hands. I could hear the men shouting, their footsteps pounding as they gave chase. We reached the upper level and found ourselves in a maze of catwalks and suspended walkways. The factory floor stretched out below us, a labyrinth of shadows and rusted metal. "Which way?" Sarah panted. I looked around frantically. "There." I pointed to a door on the far side of the room. It was marked with a faded exit sign. We ran across the catwalks, the whole structure swaying precariously under our weight. Behind us, I could hear the men climbing up after us. We reached the door, and I yanked it open, revealing a rusted fire escape. Without hesitation, we started down. We were about halfway down when I heard a gunshot, the sound echoing through the cavernous factory. "Keep moving," I shouted. We practically fell down the last few flights, our feet clanging on the metal steps. As soon as we hit the ground, we ran. We didn't stop running until we reached Liam's car, parked a few blocks away. We piled in, Noah still groggy but conscious, and Liam peeled out of there like the devil himself was on our tail. It wasn't until we were miles away, the factory a distant silhouette, that we finally allowed ourselves to breathe. What just happened?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. I told them everything I had seen about the drug deal, the chase, the narrow escape. As I spoke, the reality of what we had just been through began to sink in. We debated about whether to go to the police, but fear won out. What if those men had connections? What if they came after us or our families? In the end, we made a pact to never speak of what happened that day. That day changed us all. We'd gone looking for a thrill and found terror instead. The nightmares lasted for weeks, months for some of us. Every unexpected noise made us jump, every stranger on the street a potential threat. But it also brought us closer together. We'd faced death and come out the other side. That kind of experience bonds you in ways nothing else can. We never went urban exploring again. The thrill wasn't worth the risk. But sometimes, when I pass an abandoned building, I can't help but wonder what secrets it might be hiding. And I shudder, remembering the day our curiosity almost got us killed. The coffee house creeper. I knew a guy named Michael who ran a coffee house. It was a pretty hip place, kind of beatnik, live music, poetry readings, and open mic nights. But something about Michael was just a little off. He was the kind of guy who would stare at you for a beat too long when making eye contact. Girls all hated him and were completely creeped out by him. He had long hair, a beard, and drove a van, which didn't make anything any better. He just had an innate creepiness about him. If you asked him how he was doing, he was the kind of guy who would respond with, "Oh, I'm good, just cutting up hookers and shoving them in dumpsters." Everyone just kind of knew he was joking, but still, who the hell talks like that? After about a year, he sold the coffee house to a friend, and I ended up managing it. Business picked up pretty quickly after word got out that Michael wasn't around anymore. The place was really starting to turn a profit, and everything was going great. And then he started hanging out every now and then, being his creepy old self, leering at teenage girls and just being generally inappropriate. I eventually had to ask him not to come back, and it got ugly. He made a scene. Fast forward about 4 years, and I'm sitting on my couch watching TV. The local news comes on, and his face pops up on the screen. He had been arrested for raping and torturing 3 women. He was found with a woman shackled in the back of his van, and he had been driving around all night, tasering and raping her. He's currently serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Shadows in Oak Ridge. The flickering fluorescent light above buzzed like an angry wasp, casting long, eerie shadows across the deserted corridors of the Oak Ridge office complex. It was just another quiet night for Michael, the night janitor, or so he thought. Little did he know that in a matter of hours, he'd be fighting for his life, trapped in a place he once considered utterly mundane and safe. Michael had been cleaning the Oak Ridge offices for the past 5 years. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and allowed him to pursue his passion for writing during the quiet hours. He knew every nook and cranny of the building, from the CEO's spacious corner office on the top floor to the dusty storage closets in the basement. But on that fateful night, even his intimate knowledge of the building wouldn't be enough to protect him. It started like any other shift. He arrived at 10 p.m., just as the last few workaholics were leaving. He exchanged a tired smile with Emily from accounting, her arms laden with files. "Another late night, Emily?" he'd asked, holding the door open for her. "You know how it is during tax season. Michael," she sighed. "See you tomorrow." He started his rounds on the top floor, working his way down, vacuuming the carpets, emptying the trash bins, wiping down surfaces. It was mindless work, leaving his thoughts free to wander. He was deep in thought about the plot of his latest short story when he heard it, a crash followed by muffled curses. He froze, his hand still gripping the vacuum cleaner. The sound had come from downstairs, maybe the third or fourth floor. His first thought was that Emily had come back for something she'd forgotten, but Emily didn't curse like that. Cautiously, he made his way to the stairwell. The dim emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows as he descended, his heart pounding with each step. As he reached the fourth floor landing, he heard voices, low, urgent whispers that sent a chill down his spine. He eased the door open a crack, peering into the darkened office space. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 men, dressed all in black, were systematically rifling through desks and filing cabinets. They moved with a practiced efficiency, clearly looking for something specific. One of them held a small flashlight, its beam dancing across the room. Intruders, thieves, and here he was, alone in the building with them. He let the door close silently, his mind racing. He needed to call the police, but his cell phone was in his locker in the basement. The landlines on this floor would be useless. The phone system shut down automatically after hours. He had to get to the security office on the ground floor. It had a dedicated phone line and a direct link to the police. As quietly as he could, he crept down the stairs. He had just reached the 3rd floor when he heard the stairwell door above him creak open. They were coming down. Panic surged through him. He yanked open the 3rd floor door and slipped inside, praying they hadn't seen him. He could hear their footsteps echoing in the stairwell as they descended. "Check this floor," he heard one of them say. "We need to find those files." Michael's heart hammered in his chest. He looked around frantically for a place to hide. The open office layout offered few options, but then he spotted it, the supply closet. He darted across the room, wincing at the sound of his own footsteps. He had just pulled the closet door closed behind him when he heard them enter the floor. He pressed himself against the back wall of the cramped closet, surrounded by the smell of cleaning supplies and paper, trying to control his breathing. Through the slats in the door, he could see flashlight beams sweeping across the office. "Nothing here." One of them growled after what felt like an eternity. "Let's try the next floor." Michael waited until he could no longer hear their footsteps before allowing himself to breathe again. But he knew he couldn't stay there. He had to get to that security office. Easing the closet door open, he peered out into the darkness. The coast seemed clear. He crept towards the stairwell, every nerve on high alert. He had just reached the stairs when he heard a shout from above. "Hey, there's someone down there." They'd seen him. He bolted, taking the stairs 2 at a time, racing towards the ground floor. He could hear them behind him, their heavy footfalls echoing off the concrete walls. He burst out of the stairwell and into the main lobby. The security office was just across the atrium. He was halfway there when a figure stepped out in front of him, blocking his path. Michael skidded to a halt, nearly falling. The man lunged for him, but years of navigating cluttered offices with his cleaning cart had made him surprisingly agile. He ducked under the man's grasp and sprinted for the elevators. He jabbed the call button repeatedly, knowing it was useless. The elevators were shut down for the night. But next to the elevators was a door marked "Maintenance." Beyond it, a ladder led to the roof. He yanked the door open and started climbing, his arms burning with the effort. Above him, he could hear the maintenance door slam open again. They were following him. He reached the roof access hatch and pushed it open, gasping in the cool night air as he pulled himself up onto the gravel-covered roof. Stars twinkled overhead, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. He ran to the edge of the roof, looking for a way down. There was none. He was trapped. The hatch clanged open behind him. He turned to see the 3 men climbing onto the roof, their faces contorted with anger. Nowhere to run now, One of them sneered, advancing towards him. Michael backed up until he felt the low wall at the edge of the roof against his legs. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I won't say anything. Just let me go." The man in the lead, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a scar running down his cheek, laughed. "Sorry, pal. Can't take that risk." He lunged at Michael. In that split second, time seemed to slow down. Michael saw the man's hand reaching for him, saw the malice in his eyes, and made a decision. He vaulted over the low wall. For a heart-stopping moment, he was in freefall. Then his feet hit something solid, the window washing platform, left in place by the crew earlier that day. He heard shouts of surprise from above as he frantically worked the controls. The platform lurched into motion, slowly descending the side of the building. But he wasn't safe yet. He could see one of the men leaning over the edge of the roof, taking aim with what looked like a gun. Michael pressed himself against the side of the building as the first shot pinged off the metal platform. The second shot shattered one of the support cables. The platform tilted dangerously, and Michael had to grab the railing to keep from falling. He was still 4 stories up, too high to jump. That's when he saw it, a window left open on the 3rd floor. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. As the platform swung wildly, he timed his move. 1, 2, 3, he leaped. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd miscalculated. Then his hands caught the windowsill. Pain shot through his arms as he hauled himself inside, collapsing onto the floor of an empty office. He didn't allow himself a moment to rest. He could hear the commotion in the stairwell. They were coming down after him. He ran for the elevators. They were still powered down, but there was an emergency phone inside. He wrenched open the doors and grabbed the phone. 911, what's your emergency? He'd never been so glad to hear those words. The next few minutes were a blur. He stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, hidden in the elevator, until he heard the welcome sound of police sirens approaching. The would-be thieves were caught trying to flee the building. It turned out they were after confidential client information, data that could have ruined lives if it had fallen into the wrong hands. As Michael sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket wrapped around his shoulders, he watched the men being led away in handcuffs. One of them, the scarred leader, caught his eye. The look he gave Michael sent chills down his spine. He gave his statement to the police, then went home to his worried wife and sleeping children. As he hugged them tight, he realized how close he'd come to never seeing them again. He didn't work nights anymore. The company offered him a day position with better pay, partly out of gratitude, partly out of guilt for the lax security that had put him in danger. Sometimes, when he's leaving the office in the evening and sees the night janitor starting his shift, he feels a pang of something. Fear, sympathy, he's not sure which. He wants to warn him, to tell him to be careful, to always be on guard. But he doesn't. He just nods and smiles, and hopes that his nights will be quieter than his own had been. And as he drives home, he's grateful for the mundane, for the ordinary, because he knows now how quickly it can all change, how thin the line is between routine and terror. And he never takes an uneventful night for granted again. The mysterious phone call. One night when I arrived for work at the prison, my supervisor, Dave, looked confused and asked me what I was doing there. "I'm here for work," I said, to which he replied, "But they said you called in a few hours ago saying you were sick." Confused, I responded that it must have been someone else and they got the message wrong. It was a bit weird, but we carried on as usual and assigned everyone their posts for the night. I went to work in the control room, the central hub of the prison with direct control over cameras, doors, phones, and everything else. After relieving the guard on duty and settling in, I looked at the message that said I had called in sick. It claimed I had called at 6:50 and said I'd gotten sick while cleaning up after the storm. There had indeed been a storm the night before, but it wasn't anything I had to go out and clean up after. It was truly strange. Dave came into the control room around that time. He was also a friend of mine outside of work, and we started discussing the odd phone call. I decided to call my wife, and at home to tell her about it while Dave was still in the room. I picked up the phone and dialed. After 2 rings, A man with a raspy voice answered, "Hello." I was speechless for a few seconds. I checked the phone to make sure I had dialed the right number, and I had. After a few more seconds, I then asked, "Where is Anne?" He responded, "Anne? In bed." "Who the hell is this?" I dropped the phone and told Dave to ring me out. I had to get home. I took off towards the door, and I could hear Dave pick up the phone behind me and say, "Hello," followed directly by, "What the hell?" I ran to my car and drove home faster than the speed limit allowed, my mind racing the entire time. I burst through the door, and my wife was sitting there watching TV, surprised to see me. I asked her who was there, and she said nobody and asked what I was talking about. After a long talk with my wife, I went to call the prison to tell them what was going on, but the phone was disconnected. I went back to work, and when I came in, Dave was acting weird. He asked me how the hell I was doing this. He told me that when I left, he picked up the phone, and the person on the other end sounded exactly like me. He said he was completely freaked out and hung up the phone. A minute later, as he was watching me leave the parking lot, my house phone called. He answered, and it was me asking what was going on. He said that I sounded irate and said that I was sick and didn't feel like playing games and was telling him to leave me alone. After convincing him that I had no idea what was going on, we went back to work. Later, I found out that the phone line for my area had been knocked one out the night before by the storm. This is absolutely the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. I don't know that I will ever be able to explain it. The babysitter and the game master. The soft glow of the TV flickered in the darkened living room, casting long shadows across the walls. Little Ethan had been asleep for hours, and I was settling in for a quiet night of babysitting. But as I absent-mindedly scrolled through my phone, a message popped up that made my blood run cold. In that instant, I realized this ordinary suburban home had become the stage for a terrifying game of cat and mouse. My name is Olivia, and I've been babysitting for the Miller family for about 6 months. They were great people with an adorable kid, and the extra cash helped pay for my college textbooks. It was supposed to be just another Friday night job, but it turned into the most horrifying experience of my life. The evening had started normally enough. I arrived at 7 p.m., just as Mr. and Mrs. Miller were heading out for their date night. Ethan, their 8-year-old son, was already in his pajamas, eager to show me his latest Lego creation. "Now, Olivia," Mrs. Miller said as she adjusted her earrings. "Ethan's allowed 1 hour of tablet time before bed. The parental controls are on, so he should only be able to access his games and approved websites." I nodded, having heard the spiel many times before. "No worries, Mrs. Miller. We'll be fine." If only I had known how wrong I was. After the Millers left, Ethan and I had dinner. He chatted excitedly about school and his friends, and I listened with half an ear, smiling and nodding at the appropriate moments. Around 8 p.m., I handed him his tablet for his allotted screen time. "Remember, just 1 hour, buddy," I said. "Then it's bedtime." Ethan nodded, already engrossed in whatever game he was playing. I settled onto the couch with my phone, scrolling through social media and texting friends. At 9 p.m., I told Ethan it was time for bed. He grumbled a bit, but handed over the tablet without too much fuss. As I tucked him in, he seemed a little quieter than usual. "Everything okay, Ethan?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Olivia, is it okay to have secret friends?" Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. "What do you mean by secret friends, Ethan?" He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Just someone I talk to sometimes. But it's a secret." Alarm bells started ringing in my head. "Ethan, who is this secret friend? How do you talk to them?" But Ethan had clammed up. He rolled over, pulling the covers up to his chin. "Never mind. Good night, Olivia." I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Should I press him for more information? Call his parents? In the end, I decided to check the tablet first. Maybe I was overreacting. Back in the living room, I unlocked the tablet. At first glance, everything seemed normal, just the usual games and child-friendly apps. But then I noticed an app one didn't recognize. It had a colorful icon of a cartoon dragon. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a game at all, but a messaging app. And there, in the chat history, was a conversation that made my skin crawl. The messages were from someone calling themselves Dragon Dude 12. At first, they seemed innocent enough, asking about Ethan's favorite games and what he was learning in school. But as I scrolled, the tone changed. Remember, Ethan, this is our secret. Don't tell your parents or your babysitter. I can't wait to meet you in person. It'll be so much fun. I'll be coming to see you very soon. Maybe even tonight. My hands trembled as I gripped the tablet. This wasn't just some online predator grooming a child from afar. This Dragon Dude 12 was planning to come here tonight. I grabbed my phone, about to call the police, when a message popped up on the screen. It was from an unknown number. Hello, Olivia. Ethan's asleep now, isn't he? Why don't you let me in so we can surprise him? Terror washed over me in an icy wave. He was here outside the house watching. I ran to the windows, making sure they were all locked. I could see nothing but darkness, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. I quickly drew all the curtains, my mind racing. I needed to call the police, but what if he heard me? What if he decided to break in before help could arrive? Another message pinged on my phone. Come on, Olivia. Don't be rude. I've come all this way. I muted my phone, my heart pounding. I had to protect Ethan. I had to think. I crept upstairs, wincing at every creak of the floorboards. Ethan was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking outside. I gently shook him awake. Ethan, I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm. We need to play a game. It's called hide and seek. But we have to be very, very quiet. Okay? Ethan, still half asleep, nodded. I led him to his parents' room, to the walk-in closet I knew was there. You hide in here, I said, pushing aside hanging clothes to reveal a small space at the back. Don't come out until I come get you, no matter what you hear. Okay? It's very important. Ethan nodded again, his eyes wide. He could sense my fear, even if he didn't understand it. I closed the closet door, then the bedroom door, hoping it would be enough to keep him safe. Back downstairs, I grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen block. It felt awkward and heavy in my hand, but it was better than nothing. Another message on my phone. I'm getting impatient, Olivia. Maybe I'll just let myself in. I heard a noise from the back of the house, the distinct sound of the patio door sliding open. He was inside. I pressed myself against the wall next to the kitchen doorway, knife raised, barely daring to breathe. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. Ethan? A man's voice called softly. It's me, Dragon Dude 12. I've come to play. The footsteps were getting closer. I could see a shadow approaching the kitchen doorway. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I saw a hand appear around the doorframe, then an arm, then a shoulder. Without thinking, I swung the knife. There was a yell of pain and surprise. The man stumbled back, clutching his arm where I'd slashed him. He was tall and heavy-set, with a scraggly beard and wild eyes, nothing like the friendly persona he'd created online. You little, he snarled, lunging at me. I dodged, but he was faster than I expected. He grabbed my wrist, squeezing until I dropped the knife, clattered to the floor. We grappled, his strength overwhelming. He slammed me against the wall, knocking the wind out of me. His hand found my throat, squeezing. Where is he? He growled. Where's Ethan? I clawed at his hand, gasping for air. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. This was it, I thought. I was going to die. Then, through the roaring in my ears, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Police sirens. The man's grip loosened in surprise, and I took my chance. I brought my knee up hard, catching him in the groin. He doubled over with a grunt of pain, and I shoved past him, running for the front door. I yanked it open just as a police car screeched to a halt in the driveway. Help! I screamed. He's inside. The next few minutes were a blur. Police officers swarmed the house. The man, whose real name I later learned was Richard Kendall, was tackled trying to escape through the back. Ethan was found safe in the closet, terrified but unharmed. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, answering a detective's questions, I watched them lead Kendall away in handcuffs. He caught my eye, and the look he gave me was pure hatred. I shuddered, knowing that if the police hadn't arrived when they did, things could have ended very differently. It turned out that one of the neighbors had seen a strange man lurking around the house and called the police. I'd never been so grateful for nosy neighbors. The Millers arrived home to a scene of chaos and police cars, an ambulance, their house a crime scene. They were horrified by what had almost happened and incredibly grateful that I had protected Ethan. In the days that followed, as the story hit the local news, I was hailed as a hero. But I didn't feel like one. I felt scared, violated, and angry. Angry at Kendall for preying on an innocent child. Angry at myself for not realizing sooner what was happening. And angry at the world for being a place where such monsters exist. I don't babysit anymore. The trauma of that night left scars that are still healing. But I did start volunteering for an organization that teaches kids about online safety. If I can prevent even one child from going through what Ethan almost did, maybe some good can come from that terrifying night. Every time I pass the Miller's house, I remember the fear, the adrenaline, the moment I thought it was all over. But I also remember that I survived, that I protected Ethan. And I know that no matter how dark the world can be, there's always hope, as long as there are people willing to stand up to the darkness. The prank call. When I was 16, I worked at an ice cream store. One late night at the beginning of March, when Canada was still blanketed in thick snow, I received a chilling phone call. A man's voice whispered eerily on the other end. I looked around in a panic, the store's large glass windows offering no concealment from the darkness outside. The man on the phone began to vividly describe how he planned to murder me. Terrified, I hung up as soon as I could. I rushed to lock all the doors and hid behind the counter, clutching the phone. I couldn't help but cry. I called my boss and told him what happened, asking if I should call the police. His answer shocked me. He said it was just a prank and told me to reopen the store. He insisted the man was probably joking and I should just go back to work. I couldn't believe him. It was minus 15 degrees outside, and no one would be coming in for ice cream. Yet, he wanted me to endanger myself after such a threat. I called my dad, who was furious. He arrived within 5 minutes and took me home. Needless to say, I never went back to that store or spoke to my old boss again. It was the most terrifying experience I've ever had.